Imagine for a moment that it's a quiet morning in Vienna, sometime around the mid-1800s. A fog rolls gently along the Danube, and the first hints of pale light begin to slip between the grand stone facades of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. From the outside, the manors are silent, dignified, and immaculately preserved. Velvet curtains are drawn. Gas lamps flicker in long corridors. And if you listen carefully, you won't hear a single sound. But inside those walls, someone is already awake. Not one person, in fact, but dozens. Beneath the salons and ballrooms and private libraries, down in the basement kitchens and servant quarters, a quiet rhythm of labor is already underway. There is no applause. There was no sunrise to greet the maids and footmen when they stirred. No alarm clocks, either. Facing down the polished parquet floors of the breakfast room, these were not floors you swept casually. They were herringbone-laid masterpieces of oak and walnut. This meant hauling heavy. Dusty buckets of coal up and down narrow stairwells that weren't built for speed or comfort. In the basement, where dampness clung to the stone walls, they would rinse linens in icy tubs of water and wring them out by hand, backs bent at painful angles. The water was rarely clean and never warm. Some developed permanent swelling in their joints before the age of 30. Just as the final coal was placed in the parlor's fireplace, the bell would ring. That small, decisive ding from the master's bedroom, the household was awake, and the real day, had begun. If one dropped a nobleman's shirt on the wet floor, they didn't say anything. There was no break between their dawn tasks and their daytime duties. They simply shifted roles. The footman who polished boots at sunrise now waited at the door with a cloak. The maid who had washed a dozen nightgowns before breakfast now stood behind a curtain, holding a hairbrush the Countess would never thank her for using. They simply picked it up, smoothed it out. They didn't collapse or snore or draw attention. The implication that servants, too, might be human. Just a moment of sway, a twitch of the eyelid. Once, it was said, the butler of a prominent family had a boy, dismissed because he was caught yawning while lighting the drawing-room chandelier, and prayed no one noticed. Because if they did, they'd be told that someone else could do better. A young boy, barely old enough to be considered employable, might be tasked with lighting the fire in the master's study before 6. He'd creep through the drawing room, careful not to brush against the upholstery, careful not to knock over the porcelain dog that was perched on the edge of the hearth. That dog had outlived 3 servants already, all dismissed after accidents. Waxed to such a high shine that a careless footprint was considered nearly criminal. So they scrub it in long, slow motions, damp cloth in one hand, buffer in the other. No talking. No humming. The nobles must not be disturbed, even by the sound of cleaning. If the staircase creaked under your foot, you were expected to remember which steps did that and avoid them next time. 1 foot wrong on the marble, and the head housekeeper might appear out of nowhere, whispering the kind of reprimand that made your stomach twist. She never raised her voice. That would be uncouth. But she had a way of saying your name like it was a disappointment. Just the sound of elbow grease and occasionally a suppressed cough echoing in the early silence. Toast at a diagonal, egg centered. If jam had formed a skin on the top, it had to be scraped off and discarded. The master's preferences weren't written down. You just had to know. His mood, his routine, his dislike for strong coffee in the winter months. A mistake might earn you a scowl. 2 mistakes might mean being reassigned to outdoor duties, which in winter meant shoveling snow in linen gloves. Most servants simply trained themselves to wake at a certain time. Like creatures of habit finely tuned to the rhythm of bells that had not yet rung, and if they overslept, that wasn't considered an accident. It was a failure. There is no warmth. Only the shuffle of tired feet and the clink of coal buckets being hauled across cold stone floors. In this story, we're not following the nobleman with the waxed mustache or the countess with the collection of Parisian lace. We are tracing the invisible hands that made Viennese aristocracy sparkle, of a life lived always in someone else's shadow. The hands that laid the fires, that polished the boots, that scrubbed the gilded mirrors until their own reflections looked like ghosts. the hands that dared not tremble when holding a tray for a baroness too proud to look up. This is a quiet history of servitude, etiquette, and exhaustion. It is the sound of a back door closing softly before the front door is ever opened. And it begins, as many of their days did, well before the sun had risen. Chapter 1. Polishing floors in silence before the household wakes. The day began long before it was called a day. By the time the manor's clock struck 5, the scullery maids were already up and on their knees. Coal fires had to be started in every occupied room, even in summer. The laundry maids, often the lowest rank and least spoken to, had their own rituals. In the grand halls upstairs, silence was the goal. Breakfast trays had to be arranged just so. And then, just as the last piece of silverware was set straight, servants did not relax after this. Sometimes one of the younger boys would fall asleep while standing. It wasn't a yawn that offended. It was the suggestion of weariness. Once the household had fully stirred, the pressure only increased. Unlike their noble employers, servants did not enjoy leisurely breakfasts, soft sunlight, or idle conversation in the conservatory. Their mornings were governed by precision and timing. The table linens must be ironed without creases. The tea must steep for precisely 4 minutes, not 3, not 5. If a footman appeared out of breath, he was reprimanded. There was often no real breakfast for them until mid-morning, if at all. Every servant had to be immaculately dressed, though they often only 1 or 2 uniforms. These had to be maintained with meticulous care, starched, brushed, and free of lint or fraying. A frayed cuff could cost you your job. A missing button might be enough to warrant a warning. They had to be so clean that they shone like mirrors. Just a stiff blanket and a bell on the wall in case someone needed her in the night. She would sleep facing the wall, shoes beside her bed, apron folded over a chair. And she would dream, if she dreamed at all, of silence, polished floors, and footsteps that never came. You could be dismissed for smudging them. And so every evening, long after the family had retired and the guests had gone, someone would return to them. A maid with a cloth, sometimes still in her apron, would polish the floors again. She would wipe away every trace of the day, every footprint, every fleck of ash, and leave them gleaming. Not because she was thanked, but because if she didn't, she'd hear about it. Perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually. And if the master noticed a stain before you did, the humiliation could follow you for days in the way others stared. In the way they didn't stand next to you when the household lined up in the corridor for inspection. Usually bread, thick and dry, sometimes spread with goose fat or leftover drippings from the night before. The youngest ones, especially the kitchen boys, often stole scraps when no one was looking, until one was caught. And the entire staff was reminded in very clear terms that theft was theft, even if it was only a crust of bread. The boy cried and then he was gone. No one ever knew where exactly. Just gone. Doors were to be opened quietly, bells answered within moments, trays carried at shoulder height, never lower, never wobbling. There was a particular way to knock on a door. If a nobleman addressed a servant directly, it was almost always to correct them. Most preferred to speak as if the servant wasn't present at all. "Tell the girl this wasn't dusted," they'd say, while standing directly in front of her. And the girl, who may have risen at 4, scrubbed until her knuckles bled, and stood in place for an hour with her silver tray. She'd curtsy, nod, and say, "Yes, sir." Too soft, and you were ignored. Too loud, and you risked waking the wrong person. The way they disappeared from rooms without ever being seen in them. One young maid reportedly worked for 3 years in the same household and was never once spoken to by the Baron. She said she was grateful for it. It meant she had done nothing wrong. Many practiced their knocks privately, like musicians tuning an instrument they would never get credit for playing. And the eggs, well, it was widely understood that the mistress of the house had sent away a cook once because the yolks were slightly too firm. The new cook never made that mistake. In fact, he developed a tremor in his left hand from the constant tension of second-guessing boiling water. The upper servants, like the butler and housekeeper, were often seen as the rulers of the servant world. They dressed better, spoke more softly, and rarely carried coal or scraped burnt porridge from the bottom of a pot. These were not the delicate pots of your modern kitchens. They were cast iron, warped from heat, and always soot-stained. Scrubbing required a wire brush and lye soap. Their hands cracked, bled, and often smelled of onions, no matter how much they washed. Gloves were a luxury they could not afford, and even if they had them, they would have been told not to use them. The belief was that true cleanliness required contact, and contact required skin. But their days were no less punishing, only less visible. The butler, for instance, was expected to memorize the seating order for every dinner guest in the last 6 months. If a guest sat beside the wrong person, someone they had once insulted, or someone who spoke only Hungarian, it reflected badly on him. And if the wine pairing didn't suit the soup, well, that was a mistake with consequences. The kind that came up later, in whispers in letters, and occasionally, in dismissals cloaked as reassignment. The scullery maids, poor things, were never even considered visible. They scrubbed the pots after everyone else had gone to bed. Even walking through the manor had its silent rules. Servants had to move quickly, but never look hurried. If a maid was seen running, it was disgraceful. And though the day had officially begun, many servants still hadn't eaten. Clothing was another battlefield of expectations. There were no compliments. No thank yous. No glances of acknowledgement unless it was to critique. For many, the real cruelty wasn't in the tasks themselves. It was in the silence, the way their names were forgotten. The floors of the manor remained the most sacred space. And then, finally, she'd return to her cot in the servants' quarters. No pillow, no window. By the time the fog lifted off the Danube, she would already be awake again. Chapter 2. The Backstairs Hierarchy. If you had walked through the front doors of a grand Viennese manor in the 1800s, you might have been struck by the opulence first, the heavy velvet drapes, the glint of chandeliers, the hush of polite conversation echoing through marbled halls. But beneath that elegance existed another realm, one with its own rules, rhythms, and ranks, a hidden society that mirrored the house above, but followed an entirely different set of values. This was the backstairs world, the realm of servants. And just like the world upstairs, it had its own aristocracy. A valet was more than a servant. He was an extension of his master's public persona. Their appearance was part of the household's prestige. Some families chose footmen based on height alone, ensuring uniformity when they stood in a line. Their job may have looked ceremonial, but it was exacting. A footman who misjudged the pour of wine or brought the wrong coat was ridiculed not just by his superiors, but by his peers. Their tasks were endless and thankless lighting fires, running errands, carrying messages between staff who wouldn't speak to one another directly. They slept on thin mattresses under staircases and were expected to keep out of sight when not working. Once, a hallboy fell asleep standing up during a dinner service and was promptly dismissed. He had been working 18 hours a day for 6 weeks. No one asked why he was tired. Status among footmen mattered. The first footman had seniority. The second footman had to defer. And the new footman, every servant knew their place, and they also knew the next rung. If a valet made a mistake, he might simply be warned in private with a nod and a stern look. The rules were layered, just like the people. And if you ever forgot your place, someone would remind you. A kitchen maid could dream of becoming a cook's assistant. A parlor maid might one day become a lady's maid. The climb was slow, uncertain, and often brutal. It depended on more than skill. It relied on the favor of superiors, good health, quiet obedience, and quite often sheer luck. A cook's assistant might move up because someone else got sick. A footman might be promoted because another footman dropped a tray in front of a visiting duke. He was the one given the worst shifts and the oldest shoes. He selected suits, shined boots, prepared bath water, and occasionally offered quiet advice. They operated in the silent hours, gliding from one room to the next, invisible yet essential. They were the youngest, the newest, the most disposable. The kitchen maid might spend her entire day chopping onions or plucking chickens. The scullery maid, often only 12 or 13, cleaned everyone else's mess. She woke before anyone else, slept after everyone else, and was blamed for just about everything. If a pot was scorched, it was her fault. If the soap was missing, she had misplaced it. If someone important slipped on a damp floor, she hadn't dried it quickly enough. Unlike scullery maids or kitchen girls, parlor maids wore neater uniforms and were occasionally seen from a distance by the family. For this reason, they had to maintain a certain posture, a certain stillness. If they scratched their nose, sighed, or looked distracted, they were told they lacked grace. And grace, apparently, was as important as soap. The lady's maid did the same for her mistress, arranging curls, fixing gowns, soothing nerves. Unlike maids who scrubbed floors, she was often educated, multilingual, and entrusted with secrets. There were even tales of ladies' maids who knew more about their mistress's marriage than her husband did. Contrary to what some might think, the servant class was far from equal. There were layers, status, privilege, competition. A scullery maid who cleaned pots in the basement had little in common with the butler who oversaw the wine cellar, and was sometimes invited to speak with the master directly. The kitchen maid knew better than to look a lady's maid in the eye. And the valet, with his press cuffs and quiet confidence, she managed the linen inventory, the cleaning schedules, and the day-to-day appearance of the house. She knew exactly how many towels were in the guest bath and how many stitches were used to repair the lace on a dinner napkin. She rarely raised her voice, but when she did, it carried down stairwells like a gust of winter wind. She was not to be trifled with, rarely spoke to anyone but the butler or his own master. There were unspoken rules about who could sit where in the servants' hall, who could use the nicer soap, or who got first pick at the leftover bread crusts. At the very top stood the butler and the housekeeper. These two were the stewards of discipline, order, and appearance. The butler was often an older man, usually someone with a firm jaw and a gaze that could silence an entire room of footmen with a single raised eyebrow. His domain was the wine cellar, the silver, the formal dining rituals, and most importantly, the management of the male staff. He kept the keys to locked cabinets and knew the worth of every spoon in the house. In some cases, he even handled household finances, though always under the watchful eye of the master. The housekeeper, meanwhile, ruled the female staff with similar authority. Below them were the personal attendants, the valet and the lady's maid. These roles were prized and guarded fiercely. Next came the footmen and parlor maids. Footmen were the polished, good-looking young men in livery who served at meals, answered doors, and escorted guests. Parlor maids were responsible for dusting, polishing, and setting rooms to perfection. Then came the underbelly of the hierarchy, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, the boot boys, and hall boys. Hall boys were barely more than children, often hired from orphanages or the countryside. The invisible glue that held this strange ladder together was ambition. Punishments also varied by rank. If a scullery maid broke a dish, she might lose her weekly wage. In this world, everyone looked up. No one looked down. Though the world of servants operated in shadow, it was anything but simple. Titles may not have been written down, but everyone knew them. And while the noble family concerned themselves with diplomacy, fashion, and opera, the true intrigues of the house unfolded below the floors. In the creak of staircases and the hush of whispered rivalry, servants, after all, lived on top of each other. Everyone wanted to move up. But promotion was rare, and failure was public, and as in any closed system, gossip flowed like water. Sometimes they vanished overnight, bags packed without goodbye. No one knew whether they had been dismissed or promoted or, worse, ruined. Servants who returned after such vanishing acts rarely spoke of what had happened. Too much closeness, and it was assumed you were plotting. When it came, one footman forgot to trim the wick in the drawing-room candle. The resulting smoke made the Baroness cough. He was transferred to the stables. Another was caught reading a borrowed novel in the laundry room. Not stealing, not damaging, just reading. He was told books were for those who had finished their duties. He was reassigned to outdoor work, even in snow, was rarely fair. No trembling hands. No shaking knees. The manor didn't care if you were tired or sore or hungry. It only cared that the mirror gleamed, the boots shone, and the guest never had to ask for anything twice. It could be earned, yes, through years of silence and sweat, through knowing every tick of a master's routine, through never once looking tired. But it could also come by chance. One lady's maid died suddenly of fever, and the replacement had only been in the house a week. No one understood why. She was clumsy, and worse, she didn't curtsy properly. Yet there she was, combing the countess's hair with hands that still smelled of onions, people guessed. Perhaps her mother had served the family years ago. Perhaps she had dirt on someone. Or perhaps the countess simply liked her face. Too little, and you had no one to defend you when accusations came. Rivalries simmered beneath surface politeness. A scullery maid who broke a dish might find herself blamed for one she hadn't touched. A valet who earned praise might find his shaving kit tampered with the next day. A ladder with no end. A world of service built not only on labor, but on silence, observation, and obedience. You might never rise far, but if you slipped, everyone would see. These were not acts of malice, necessarily. Just the cost of survival in a world where everyone was replaceable and no one was safe. If they did, it was only in fragments, vague and bitter. One girl came back with a silk scarf no one had seen before and a limp she wouldn't explain. Another returned wearing gloves in summer and never took them off. People drew conclusions, but no one asked aloud. It filled the narrow gaps between shifts, passed along in low murmurs over laundry lines or behind the pantry door. Who was seen in whose quarters? Who had spoken too familiarly to a guest? Who had been spotted crying in the coal room? Secrets were a form of power, but also a trap. A whisper could help you rise, or it could follow you forever. A parlor maid could spend a year perfecting her tray balance, her curtsies, her knowledge of silver polish, only to have her chance taken away by someone younger, prettier, or better connected. A boot boy might learn every nook of the wine cellar in hopes of impressing the butler, only to be transferred when the head footman took a dislike to his accent. Once, a young maid slipped a note to a footman she fancied. Nothing scandalous, just a note with a pressed flower and a simple line. Perhaps we might speak again in the garden. She was called before the housekeeper and asked who she thought she was. The note was read back to her in front of others, every word now sounding foolish. She wasn't dismissed. That would have been kind. Instead, she was reassigned to clean the chamber pots every day for a month. She never wrote another note. Not just in proximity, but in routine, in rumor, and in quiet rebellion. A typical manor might house 20 to 40 servants, depending on size and wealth. They slept in rooms barely large enough for two, yet sometimes shared by four. Privacy was a foreign concept. A curtain was luxury. They were performances of deference. The seating order, the order in which you were served, even the silence during chewing it all said something. If someone dared sit where they shouldn't, there were consequences. Not formal ones, perhaps, but they might find their coat mysteriously missing the next morning, or find themselves sent out in the rain for an errand that could have waited. There was no need for written punishment. The hierarchy enforced itself. Most nights, people slept shoulder to shoulder, boots by their beds, ears half-tuned to any midnight bell or cry from above. Yet even in this shared hardship, hierarchy remained. The higher-ranked staff had better rooms, ones with real mattresses, windows, perhaps a chair. The housekeeper's room was the finest of all, often complete with a writing desk and shelves for ledgers. She didn't eat with the general staff, neither did the butler. They dined alone at their own small table, the walls between them and the rest as solid as the stone foundations of a house. Down in a servant's hall, meal times weren't just for eating. One might imagine that living under such a system would inspire unity. But more often it bred quiet resentment and fierce competition. Favoritism was a currency as real as gold. If the housekeeper liked you, your errors were minor. If she didn't, your successes were invisible. There were tales whispered with both envy and suspicion, of maids who caught the eye of a noble son or guest. Crossing ranks, too, obviously was dangerous. If a kitchen maid tried to befriend a lady's maid, she might be laughed at or, worse, punished. Even friendships within one's rank had their risks. Promotion, demotion was easier to understand. A stain on the wrong garment, a late arrival. A smirk mistaken for insolence? The truth was that every servant carried their future like a tray of teacups, balanced, fragile, easily tipped. And every step had to be perfect. This was the backstairs hierarchy. And in this world, no one offered a hand to catch you. Chapter 3. The Unseen Lives of Viennese Nannies. In the great houses of 19th century Vienna, children were not raised by their parents. They were born to aristocrats, yes, announced with flair, photographed stiffly for family albums, and written about in elegant, cursive and leather-bound journals, but they were not reared by them. You were closer to the children than their mothers, yet always an outsider. You taught them to walk, to talk, to eat without spilling jam on their waistcoats. Children in these homes were expected to sit properly, use silver cutlery, and exhibit the kind of restraint that didn't come naturally to small hands. If the boy smeared jam on his cravat, the nanny was to correct it instantly without making a scene. Children were to be taught to recite poetry, to identify birds and flowers, to speak softly and fluently in French or German, depending on the guests. The child had been teething, feverish, and clearly miserable, but decorum mattered more than illness. Emily had worked there 3 years. She left with her bag and her books dismissed with no reference, which meant she would struggle to find employment again. And all because a child chose to cry at the wrong time. They were to know how to enter a room, how to bow or curtsy, how to remain silent when adults were speaking. She could enter the drawing room, but only if summoned. A child might throw a wooden horse at her head, and she would be told not to provoke such behavior again. A pressed flower they were once given. A miniature drawing. The nanny would sit in her little chair by the window, looking out at the moonlight over the garden wall, and wonder who would remember her, if anyone. And then she'd rise, check the locks, fold the blankets, and ready herself for another long day of being both everything and nothing. Things easily hidden in a drawer or stitched inside the lining of a dress. Proof that they mattered. That someone, at some point, loved them back. Not openly, not officially, but in a way that could not be denied. If the child fell and bruised their knee, she was accused of carelessness. If the child caught a cold, she must have let them outside too long. It was a job in which everything could be your fault and nothing could be acknowledged as your success. She could walk the garden paths but not sit on the benches. She could stand at the back of the church with the other servants but not kneel at the front with the family. And she was never ever to eat at the same table as those she served, even if the child begged her to stay. The answer was always, "No, darling. I must go now." No flirtations, no visitors, no opinions. If she was caught reading novels, especially romantic ones, she might be accused of improper influence. Others treated her with casual cruelty, mirroring the tone of a household where servants were spoken to like wallpaper. A boy might pull a nanny's braid or hide her gloves. A girl might scream until she fainted, knowing that any punishment would fall not on her, but on the weary woman at her side. There were no true consequences for them. Only the quiet, cumulative erosion of the nanny's spirit. If she was caught crying, she was deemed unstable. When they whispered secrets or brought her wildflowers from the garden, but even these were bittersweet. Because she knew that by the time they were 7 or 8, they would be handed over to tutors and governesses and slowly taught to forget her. To see her as a figure from early childhood, soft and disposable. Some children forgot entirely. Others remembered only the rules she had drilled into them, never the nights she held them through fever or fear. If she showed too much affection, she risked encouraging emotional weakness. Yet the child who grew too cold or cruel, still her fault. And if they failed to learn these things, it wasn't they who were scolded. It was the nanny. If the girl spilled her milk, it was not the child's fault. It was the nanny's for not preventing it. You soothed their fevers, remembered their birthdays, endured their tantrums. And when the time came for family portraits or formal dinners, you stepped aside so the family could be seen as whole. That task, like so many others, fell to the servants. And among the most overworked, overlooked, and quietly indispensable was the nanny. To be a nanny in a Viennese manor was to live in a space of contradiction. The day of a nanny began early and ended late. She might have had a small room tucked into the nursery wing narrow, plain, with a single window that stuck in winter, but she was rarely in it. Her true office was the nursery, a space both cheerful and exhausting. There were toys, yes, and little chairs, and wallpaper with birds or vines. But it was also filled with responsibility. The baby might cry all night. The toddler might refuse to eat. The older child might speak cruelly, parroting the clipped condescension of his parents. And the nanny had to bear it all with grace. Breakfast was one of the first hurdles of the day. Most nannies were women in their 20s or 30s, often unmarried, often from the countryside, often too poor to refuse the job. Some had previous experience in smaller homes. Others had been promoted from nursemaids or wet nurses. A few had children of their own, but those were usually left behind, raised by grandparents or cousins. Imagine that. Caring for someone else's child while your own learned to walk without you. A bitter trade, though one rarely spoken of. It wasn't just about feeding and bathing. The nanny was expected to educate too. One young woman, her name was Emily, was fired because her charge refused to kiss a visiting countess's hand. Nannies were expected to be moral, clean, pious, and invisible. The children themselves were not always easy. Some were kind and shy, aware in small ways that the nanny was their only comfort. There were moments of sweetness, of course, when a child reached for her hand. There were also unwritten laws about where a nanny could go. Discipline was another tightrope. The nanny was expected to maintain order, but not with severity. No raised voices, no visible anger. Many nannies carried little mementos with them. A ribbon from a child's hair. And sometimes when the house was quiet and the lamps dimmed and the children finally asleep. There was something profoundly lonely about it being a nanny. Not just because the job itself was isolating, though it was, but because it placed a woman in the middle of an emotional triangle with no safe corners. She was both guardian and ghost, both comfort and caution. The child might love her deeply but be taught to suppress it. The mistress might rely on her entirely but never say so. And the rest of the staff might view her with a mix of envy and resentment, unsure if she was a peer or a pet of the aristocracy. Jealousy ran thick, even if few admitted it. Nannies, by the nature of their work, trusted with the most intimate aspect of a family, the children. They knew which child cried at night, which one lied about eating vegetables, which one talked in their sleep. This closeness created tension. Some maids believed nannies were too soft, too indulged. Some cooks saw them as unnecessary. And sometimes a valet or footman might see a nanny receiving a kind word from the mistress and assume favoritism. But in truth, the kindness was often transactional. A brief smile after 14 hours of work, a new pair of stockings maybe, but never a break, never relief. There were even moments when a nanny had to stand between the child and the family, not just physically, but emotionally. One girl, Anna, was caught correcting a baroness's son when he mispronounced a French word. The boy had asked her for help, shyly, afraid of his governess. Anna corrected him gently, repeating the word in a sing-song voice to help him remember. But when the governess found out, Anna was chastised for overstepping. The boy was forbidden to speak to her about lessons again. His handwriting suffered. He started stuttering. But no one blamed the governess. They blamed Anna for interfering. Nannies often bore the burden of silence. If a child revealed something troubling, a cruel remark, a bruise, a secret letter, the nanny was expected to pretend she heard nothing. Reporting it might lead to a confrontation, which aristocratic families hated. Remaining silent might haunt her. But there was no right choice. In one tragic case, a nanny overheard a child being threatened by his older cousin, a boy visiting for the summer. She tried to tell the housekeeper. The housekeeper told her to mind her role. By the time the summer was over, the child had stopped speaking altogether. Years later, the nanny still wrote his name on the inside of her prayer book. Emotional attachment was the most dangerous trap of all. It happened naturally, sometimes instantly. The first time a baby gripped her finger. The first time a toddler asked her to say just 5 more minutes. And yet, she knew the attachment was temporary. When the child grew older, they would be taken away, sent to tutors, boarding schools, or foreign relatives. Their memories would fade. The nanny would be left in the nursery, folding tiny clothes that no longer fit anyone, surrounded by echoes. And occasionally the pain of that loss grew too heavy. Some nannies, once dismissed or rotated out, struggled to adjust. One woman wrote daily letters to a girl she had helped raise, never receiving a single reply. Another became a schoolteacher, but never stopped carrying a pair of baby shoes in her satchel. Some simply moved to other homes, raising other children, each one blending into the next until they stopped using names in their prayers and just whispered, "My little one." There were rare exceptions. A child might grow up and remember, might write or visit, or even insist on employing the same nanny for their own children. But these stories were rare enough to become legend among the servant halls, like myths passed down between shifts. Did you hear? Lady Von Breck still keeps her old nanny on staff. Young Herr Rosen wrote to his nanny from university. These were not common, but they gave hope. The children themselves were, of course, innocent in all this. They didn't ask to be born into porcelain cribs and velvet booties. They didn't understand why their mothers handed them off to someone else's arms, and many truly loved their nannies. But the system was not built for love. It was built for image, for legacy, for control. Emotional connection was tolerated, even encouraged to a point. But once that point was crossed, the nanny became a liability. Some nannies were replaced simply because they grew too close. A child clung too tightly, refused to eat unless fed by her, sobbed when she tried to leave the room. The parents grew alarmed, not for the child's feelings, but for the nanny's influence. As if affection were a dangerous infection that needed to be cut away, these dismissals were always phrased politely. "She's being moved to another house. We've found someone with better experience. She needs time for herself." But everyone knew what they meant. There was also the matter of reputation. Nannies were held to impossible standards. Any, no matter how small, could ruin them. If someone claimed they saw her speaking too fondly to a male servant, if a letter was found tucked into her drawer, if a child cried and mentioned her name too often, all of it could be spun into suspicion. One nanny, who had worked 6 years in the same house, was dismissed after a guest claimed she looked too proud. No complaint, no mistake. Just an expression, misread and repeated. Yet through it all, nannies endured, because they had to. Because there were few other options for women of their class, education, and age. Because in spite of everything, some of them truly loved the work, loved the children, loved the quiet satisfaction of wiping away tears and being the person a child looked for when the night felt long and scary. And so they stayed. Waking early, folding small shirts, mixing milk with honey, teaching lullabies. They endured whispers, judgment, and heartbreak. They memorized every cry, every habit, every bedtime story. And they disappeared quietly when the time came. Their legacy wasn't written in ledgers. It wasn't carved into stone. But if you walked into one of those nurseries late at night and listened carefully, you might still hear something. A creaking rocking chair, the soft sigh of a lullaby, a name whispered into darkness that was never meant to be remembered, but somehow still is. Chapter 4, The Scandal of the Schönbrunn Letters. There was always something slightly unreal about the Schönbrunn Palace. Even for those who lived nearby, the place seemed frozen in a time not quite real, a kind of golden daydream left over from the Habsburgs. The housekeeper, who had once worked in the home of a countess known for her scandals, opened it. Inside its hundreds of rooms, ornate and heavy with tapestries, secrets drifted like perfume. Not every noble family lived there, of course, but many, especially those with favor at court, spent their winters within walking distance. And wherever aristocrats gathered with their powdered wigs in rigid posture, something else followed. Gossip. She said nothing to the footman, who later asked if anything had been found behind the fern. But by the end of the day, the letter was in the hands of the butler. And by the next morning, the entire servant staff knew that something was amiss. It was the winter of 1852 when the first letter appeared. This time it was found tucked into the drawer of a seldom-used sideboard in the ballroom. No envelope, just a folded slip of paper, placed inside a music book left carelessly open in the drawing room. The handwriting was messier, the words more urgent. She forbade staff from speaking to the postal couriers directly. Pillar. He began questioning his valet in strange ways. Do you think the drapes in the guest room are drawn too often? Have you seen anyone in the greenhouse recently? Harmless words, but the tone said otherwise. Friendships fractured. People who once shared bread in the scullery now avoided eye contact. The cook accused the laundry maid of reading her diary. A footman left in the middle of the night, never returning for his final wages. Even the butler, usually calm as stone, was seen checking locks twice. It was no longer just about scandal. It was about fear. Chamber pots still needed emptying. But there was an unease in the air, like the tremble before a storm. No explanation. No resolution. After the fourth letter, another vague warning, this time mentioning a masquerade ball in 1848. Nothing arrived. No more envelopes. No more threats. It was as if E had vanished, or perhaps gotten what they wanted, or perhaps had been silenced. Fear that the barrier between upstairs and downstairs, so carefully constructed, so obsessively maintained, was crumbling. It was never about money, it read. You owe me more than coin. You owe me truth. One claimed that the maid who found the first letter was offered money to stay quiet. Another believed that E had been the tutor, dismissed for reasons no one would discuss. But the impact had lingered. Not because of what they revealed, but because of what they threatened to reveal. One theory, whispered only at night, said that the letters were a test. That someone in the household was checking who could be trusted and who might speak too freely. If so, it worked. Same paper. The master of the house began staying home more often. His usual cheerful strolls were replaced with brooding walks through the library. The mistress began locking her door at night. Even a folded slip of paper could unmake the entire arrangement. A guest who had been expected from Prague suddenly canceled her visit, citing a toothache. The staff whispered more than usual, careful not to be overheard. A disgraced valet? Or worse, was it someone still among them, pretending to carry on as normal while crafting these silent little bombs? Same wax seal. This one was addressed to the master of the house, and this one named a date. March 14th. A single phrase stood out. You remember what happened on the terrace. A small envelope, ivory-toned, sealed, with a press stamp that looked vaguely like the family crest of the Hohenfelds. It was found not in the study, but slipped behind a planter in the conservatory. A maid had been dusting when she spotted it. Curious, yes, but not entirely unusual. People left things all the time, or something close to it. Written by someone who claimed to be a former servant, now in possession of information that, if revealed, would ruin a nobleman's reputation. There were no names, just suggestions. A certain trip to Prague. A certain visitor from Paris. A painting that had once hung in a guest bedroom and now was missing. The tone was neither cruel nor pleading, just ... certain, like someone who knew what they held was worth more than silence. What made it strange was the handwriting, elegant, but not quite noble. The kind of script taught at a finishing school, not born of courtly lineage, and the addressee, simply to the lady. No name, no address. The maid, who had just begun her shift and was not known for taking chances, brought it to the housekeeper. What she found inside would ripple quietly through the manor like a pebble dropped into an underground lake. The letter was a confession, and it was signed only with the letter E. The housekeeper, not one to be easily rattled, folded the paper and placed it in her apron pocket. She said nothing to the maid. The second letter came 3 days later. Nobody could say exactly what had happened on the terrace, but it didn't stop them from imagining. Within a week, the manor had shifted, and then a third letter arrived. This one was different. That sentence changed everything. Servants began looking at each other differently. Who was E? E. Was it someone they knew? A former housemaid? The housekeeper, who had kept tight rein on the staff for over a decade, began watching everyone more closely. She stopped assigning night shifts alone. The nobleman in question, though never named in any of the letters, seemed to grow thinner, and all the while the staff tried to go about their tasks. Silver still had to be polished. Children still needed their lessons. The strangest part was that the letters stopped just as suddenly as they had begun. Rumors swirled, of course. Trust collapsed. Years later, the Schönbrunn letters remained a topic of whispered conversation. Nothing was ever proven. No names were ever written in full. And for those who had lived through it, the lesson was clear, in a world so carefully composed. In the months that followed the final letter, the Schönbrunn Manor did not return to normal. It pretended to, in its way dinners were served, candles lit, boots polished, and curtains drawn at the appointed hours. But underneath it all, something had shifted. The hierarchy still stood, but with a subtle lean, like a once straight column now slightly askew. The noble family said little, and the staff said even less, but their silences echoed differently. No longer the silence of obedience, but the silence of people watching one another very, very carefully. The master of the house developed a new habit. He no longer let letters sit on his desk. Every envelope that arrived was opened immediately, read thoroughly, then either burned or locked in a small iron box in the bottom drawer of his study. No one was allowed to handle his correspondence now. Not the valet, not the footman, not even the butler. When asked why, he simply replied, "It's better this way." The mistress, who had once thrown grand musicales with invited musicians from Salzburg and guests in silk gloves, canceled them all. She claimed she had taken ill something about nerves, but most suspected she had grown weary of watching every glance, every whisper, wondering if the next scandal might arrive not by post but by word of mouth. Her lady's maid remained at her side constantly now, barely permitted to leave the room, and no longer smiled in the servants' hall. It was said she'd been instructed not to speak unnecessarily. Even those who had once claimed indifference began to feel it. The cook, a woman who had survived 5 noble households and considered gossip beneath her, started locking her recipe books at night. The scullery maid who'd been caught once reading in the pantry now refused to look up from her work. And the butler, always meticulous, added a new item to his evening inspection. A check for loose drawers, unlocked boxes, anything left unlatched that might tempt someone to peek. What no one ever discussed, at least not directly, was the undeniable truth that had come to light in the wake of the letters. Information was power. And not just the kind held by dukes or diplomats, but the kind that servants carried silently every day. A valet knew which drawer the master kept his letters in. A chambermaid knew the mistress's sleeping habits. A footman might notice which guests stayed longer than they should, or which gentleman arrived when the master was away. Nannies heard things whispered through doors. Housekeepers read forgotten notes while clearing dressing tables. Knowledge passed unnoticed, like dust in the sunlight, always there, rarely acknowledged. But now everyone had seen what could happen when that knowledge became deliberate. There were quiet adjustments. Servants began declining letters that were not directly handed to them. The postman was no longer offered tea when he arrived. A new rule was set that only the butler could handle correspondence, but even he checked each one twice before delivering it. It became common for people to speak in half sentences, hinting without confirming. "Did you hear what wasn't said at supper?" They say someone knows more than they should. Conversations were like embroidery full of flourishes, with the truth always tucked just beneath the surface. And yet, for all the fear, there was something else too. Something subtle, even empowering. Servants who had always considered themselves disposable now recognized that invisibility had its advantages. They could hear, observe, remember without being suspected. They knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, and in a few rare cases, literally. One former stable boy, long since dismissed, had once joked that the garden roses grew better over a patch of soil no one dared dig. After the letters, people wondered if that had ever been a joke. It was during this period that a young housemaid named Clara began keeping a journal. Not for revenge, not even for posterity, just to have a record of what passed through her hands each day. She noted who visited, what time the mistress returned from her walks, what color ribbon the eldest daughter wore on Tuesday. She kept the book hidden under a loose floorboard beneath her cot, and she never mentioned it to anyone. But it gave her a sense of control, a quiet assurance that if anyone ever tried to ruin her, She might have a story of her own to tell. Because if the Schönbrunn scandal had taught the staff anything, it was that the line between power and ruin was thinner than silk. One letter, one phrase, one carefully placed accusation, and the entire edifice could tremble. No one ever discovered who he truly was. Some thought it must have been a former servant, dismissed and vengeful. Others believed it was a current staff member, clever enough to stop before being caught. A few whispered that E was never a servant at all, but a member of the noble family playing a dangerous game of emotional blackmail, perhaps even to test loyalty or distract from something more serious. No theory was ever proven, and perhaps that was the point. The ambiguity itself became the punishment. Years later, when the Schönbrunn house changed hands, the new mistress asked about the servants' quarters. "Why are the bells disconnected?" she inquired. "Why do so few of the staff speak freely?" The old butler, who had stayed on out of habit more than loyalty, simply replied, "They learned to be careful." That's all. Careful, in this case, meant silent. It meant folding linens while pretending not to hear voices raised behind a door. It meant lighting candles for guests you didn't trust. It meant watching the postman leave and wondering if the next letter would bring your world crashing down. The Schönbrunn letters were never printed in the papers. The scandal remained private, its impact felt only by those who scrubbed its floors, lit its lamps, and walked its polished corridors. But they remembered. And in every household that followed, every servant who passed through Vienna in those years heard the same warning, whispered into their training. Watch what you say, watch what you know, and never write anything down. Unless, of course, you plan to make history. Chapter 5. Laundry Day in the Shadow of the Danube. If there was one job more thankless than scouring chamber pots or trimming candle wicks, it was managing the endless waves of laundry that flowed through a Viennese manor. It never stopped. It never even slowed. It was hot in summer, bone-numbingly cold in winter, and always damp. Inside were long wooden tables slick with soap residue, heavy cast iron tubs, thick ropes strung from beam to beam for drying, and the unrelenting smell of lye, sweat, and starch. No music played here. No idle chat, save for whispers during breaks that were rarely granted. It was an accident. The fabric had touched the rim of the copper pot while she was turning to grab a wooden paddle. The damage was the size of a coin. The result? A formal reprimand and a week's loss of wages. In bad weather, sheets were hung in the attic or by the kitchen hearth. But they dried slowly and often picked up the scent of smoke or meat. A clever maid might press lavender or crushed mint leaves into the folds to mask the smell, though she'd never be credited for it. The pace was relentless. There was no such thing as caught up. Even as one load dried, another was soaking. Even as one shirt was being pressed, blood on a nightgown. A torn glove never explained. A note tucked inside a pocket. A lipstick stain on a collar that didn't belong to the wife. These things were seen, noted silently, and spoken of only in locked rooms or whispered between sheets. The laundry saw everything, even if it said nothing. 5 more waited, sheets billowed like sails. Dresses swayed gently like dancers. And for a moment, a maid might stop, stretch her back, and enjoy the warm light on her face. But only for a moment. The bell would ring again. There were still towels to boil, socks to rinse, a coat to be pressed for the evening opera. The noble family didn't think about this. Why would they? Their garments simply reappeared, fresh and crisp, as if by magic. If they noticed a delay, they'd ring the bell. If a button was loose or a hem uneven, they might scold the lady's maid, who would in turn scold the laundry maid, who might scold no one, because she was too tired to speak. The scent would be admired by the mistress, attributed to good fortune or divine air. Bleach called chloride of lime was used often and carelessly. It burned the skin, irritated the eyes, and sometimes turned fabrics brittle. One maid coughed so violently after a day of bleaching that she fainted in the drying room. She was given an hour to rest, then sent back to finish her load. There was no physician, only vinegar and prayers. She wept behind the laundry house that night, her hands still red from the boiling rinse. This was a room of steam and muscle, of blisters and bruised palms. Laundry maids bent over these boards for hours, rhythmically dragging the fabric up and down until the dirt, the blood, the sweat had all been scrubbed away. Sleeves rolled high, hands raw, breath steady. Because no matter how many clothes she cleaned, the piles always grew again. Girls learned to break the ice with their knuckles or elbows, then plunge their arms in any way. There was no waiting for it to thaw, no warm gloves. The pain was simply part of the job. And still, if the garments weren't clean enough, if a white shirt came back slightly yellowed, or a lace handkerchief showed a brown edge, the maid responsible might be docked pay or forced to redo the entire load. The water turned gray, then brown, then black. Then it was replaced, and they started again, from the delicate lace-trimmed petticoats of the lady of the house to the footman's stiff collars, from the children as jam-smeared bibs to the noblemen. S-monogrammed handkerchiefs. Every thread passed through the hands of the laundry maids. They retained heat unevenly, often too much or too little. A burn could ruin an entire dress, especially if it left a shiny scorch across satin. Maids would spit on the iron surface to test its temperature, an old trick passed down from mother to daughter. A hiss meant it was ready. No hiss, and you waited. Too much hiss, and you risked disaster. Their work was invisible by design. The better they did it, the less anyone noticed. Tucked behind the main house, often near the kitchen gardens or beside the carriage path, sat the laundry house. The day began before sunrise. Fires had to be stoked under the copper boiling pots, some large enough to fit a grown child. Water was hauled in by bucket, no plumbing, no pumps, just pails dragged from outdoor wells, often by the youngest maids. These girls, sometimes as young as 10 or 11, would tip the pails into basins until their arms trembled and their shoulders ached. Some wore rags for shoes. Others went barefoot, even in frost. The sorting came next. Whites were separated from colors, fine silks from sturdy linens. But here's what people rarely realized. Aristocrats changed clothes constantly. A single dinner party might require 3 separate outfits, one for greeting guests, one for dining, and one for retiring. And each piece came with its own care instructions. Some sleeves could not be wrung. Some lace could not be boiled. Sun stains, like red wine or candle soot, had to be treated with powders or vinegar rinses or, in desperate cases, scraped gently with a dull knife. Every mistake left a mark on the fabric and on the maid's record. One girl, Annika, once scorched the edge of a petticoat belonging to a visiting duchess. Most of the work involved scrubbing. Before washing machines, before gentle detergents, there were wooden washboards and chunks of hard soap the size of bricks. In the winter, the water sometimes froze before it could be used. Drying clothes was no easier. Lines were strung high in the air, requiring stools or makeshift ladders. Ironing was a beast of its own. Flat irons were made of solid metal, heated over open flames or stoves. And always then there were the unspoken dangers. The laundry house was also where secrets clung. Sometimes on rare summer days when the sun was strong and the wind just right, the drying yard took on a kind of beauty. And so she would return. Down in the laundry rooms, even hierarchy found a way to thrive. It didn't matter that the floors were slick with soapy water or that the ceiling dripped in winter. Someone was always in charge, and someone was always one rung lower. The head laundress, usually an older woman with forearms like iron and eyes that missed nothing, was the undisputed queen of this domain. She knew which linens belonged to which guest, which dresses required steaming versus pressing, and which scullery girl could be trusted to handle a duchess's lace gloves without tearing the seams. The girls feared her, but they also respected her. She was the one who'd trained half of them, who remembered everyone's mistakes but never spoke them aloud in front of the mistress. She had her own way of punishing error, not by scolding, but by assigning the worst job, soaking diapers in the icy basin, cleaning mold off wool capes, picking bits of horsehair from riding trousers with a needle. Some girls cried, others endured. The ones who survived a full season earned the right to use the indoor drying racks and occasionally were given first pick of the still warm tea at break time. There were also unspoken rules about who handled what. A new girl never touched the master's shirts. That job went to the most precise hands. No one boiled the ladies' corsets except the head laundress. A girl with clumsy fingers was moved to rags and servant uniforms. And heaven help the one who overstarched the undergarments. Once, a valet complained that his employer's drawers were stiff enough to stand on their own, and the girl who'd done the pressing spent a week outdoors cleaning soot off the carriage wheels. Despite the harshness, there were moments of quiet pride. When a set of lace cuffs emerged from the rinse basin without a single snag, the laundress might give a slow nod of approval. If a butter stain came out of a brocade dinner gown, the responsible maid might allow herself a private smile. No one else would praise her. The mistress would never know, but she knew, and sometimes that was enough. Resistance, when it came, was subtle. You couldn't speak out. You couldn't complain, but you could fold a sheet a little tighter, scrub a little harder, pour your frustration into the rhythm of the work. Some girls hummed songs under their breath low, wordless melodies that carried pain and defiance in memory. Others exchanged tiny favors, an extra handful of soap, a corner of dry linen to use as a scarf in the winter wind. These gestures stitched a fragile sisterhood between them, even as the world above pretended they didn't exist. One year, a nobleman ordered all his bedsheets re-embroidered with a new monogram after being awarded a minor title. The seamstresses refused, claiming overwork, so the job fell to the laundry team. The girls stitched through their breaks, their fingers raw from hours of starching, their eyes blurry from steam. But when the final batch was delivered, one girl had added a small extra stitch to the corner of each pillowcase, just one. A mistake, if noticed, but more likely passed over. She called it her signature, and though she never told anyone, she watched the household use them for years, knowing her mark was there. Invisible, yet permanent. Physical exhaustion was a constant. Many maids developed swollen joints, cracked skin, even early arthritis. One girl's hands bled so badly during winter that she began wrapping them in strips of muslin soaked in goose fat. It helped, but she still flinched when handling bleach. Another girl began losing her hair, something the laundress blamed on steam exposure and nerves. She started wearing a cap, pulled low over her ears, and never spoke of it again. No one ever left work unscathed. The job left its mark on everyone, whether in scarred knuckles or in the stooped posture of a 20-year-old who already walked like someone twice her age. Still, the work went on. The fires were fed. The soaps were measured. The clothespins, often handmade from broken chair legs, were smoothed of splinters and reused until they cracked. There were never enough towels, never enough hours, and always more laundry. But every week, the manor sparkled with fresh linens. Every day, the family slipped into garments that smelled faintly of lavender or pine ash. And none of them thought to ask how it all came to be. Laundry was the only job in the house where the results were literally hung out to dry. Yet the workers remained entirely unseen. The noble guests might admire the pleats on a cravat or the crisp fold in a napkin, but no one applauded the hands that made it so. No one asked how many buckets it took, how many burns were endured, how many fingers were pricked by rogue pins. And that was perhaps the strangest truth of all. The harder the work, the more invisible its maker became. Years later, when those manors fell silent and gaslight gave way to electricity, the laundry houses were among the first rooms to be abandoned. Too damp, too old-fashioned, too inefficient. But some of the iron pots still remained rusted and moss-covered, half buried behind crumbling walls. And sometimes, if you passed near them in early morning fog, you could imagine the rhythm of hands at work. The creak of the old mangle, the hiss of the iron, and the strength of a dozen girls, bent in labor, stitching pride into the very fabric of a forgotten world. Chapter 6. A Servant's Supper, Gruel, Bread, and Scraps. There were chandeliers upstairs, dozens of them, flickering over long mahogany tables set with silver, china, and delicate wines. The nobility in the manor dined in rooms, thick with perfume, hushed voices, and polished mirrors that doubled every candle. The table was long and roughly worn, with gouges where knives had slipped and patches where the wood had been scorched by a hot kettle. After them came the cooks, footmen, senior maids, then the rest. Scullery maids and laundry girls often got what was left: a ladle of canned soup, a crust of bread that had hardened near the stove, sometimes a boiled potato if they were lucky. A visiting guest who sent back an entire course untouched. If the cook caught someone sneaking scraps too early, there'd be a punishment. Not a beating that was rare, but a reassignment to worse tasks, or an extra shift, or a warning noted in the ledger that followed you from house to house. One boy was caught hoarding carrot ends in his apron. He said it was for a stray cat behind the stables, but no one believed him. He was sent packing before the week was over. If you couldn't digest the stew, you simply worked hungry. If you fell ill, you worked anyway. If you fainted, you were told to drink water and return when steady. How often it was carried just inches from your nose on a silver tray. How frequently it was spooned onto plates and then left untouched, scraped back into the slop bucket, destined for pigs or fire or the river. Servants saw everything: the glistening pastries, the gloved hands wiping crumbs, the half-eaten roasts that would have meant warmth in their bellies. They saw it and said nothing, because saying something meant risk. And risk was rarely worth it. The idea that food should nourish was something reserved for the upstairs. A bowl of soup with an extra turnip. A biscuit tucked into a basket of laundry. These small mercies mattered. They weren't charity, they were survival. They reminded the staff that they were seen, if only for a moment. And for some, that moment was enough to keep going. A mistake in the kitchen that yielded too much of something: good tarts, ham, even cold roast beef, while the nobility toasted goose and sipped spiced wine under garlands of fir. The servants might receive a slice of preserved fruitcake or a hard-boiled egg. The butler might allow an extra cup of watered wine, and the cook might slip a sweet into someone's apron. But by the next day, it was back to scraps and routine. These moments were not celebrated with cheers, just quiet, efficient distribution. Someone remembered who liked the heel of the bread. Jokes were exchanged in whispers. Songs were sometimes hummed under breath when no one of authority was near. A servant's supper was never luxurious, but it was a moment of pause. A chance to sit, to exhale, to pretend, just briefly, that tomorrow might be easier. One footman might pass a slice of pie to a scullery maid behind the kitchen door without looking at her. She said it made the table feel cleaner. Others laughed at first, then began folding their own bits of rag or ribbon beside their bowls. No one said it, but the gesture meant something. A quiet reclaiming of dignity. A maid might sneak a roll into the pocket of a hall boy she knew hadn't eaten all day. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was survival shared in small doses. Dessert was reserved for the upstairs. Servants only saw it on the plate when scraping it into the bin after it had been half-touched by the mistress. The benches were splintered from years of use. The room smelled not of roasted duck or cream sauces. Where you sat, when you ate, how much you were served, it all revealed your place. Higher servants ate with cutlery, often from the older sets retired from upstairs. Lower staff used wooden spoons or shared chipped bowls. You didn't reach across the table. You didn't speak too loudly, and you certainly didn't ask for seconds unless invited. But of damp wool, old onions, and the faint, ever-present scent of floor soap. If the bread had mold on it, you tore it off and ate the rest. If the gruel was burnt, you stirred it quickly and said nothing. A complaint marked you as ungrateful, and being ungrateful was dangerously close to being unnecessary. Their dinners were slow and ceremonial. Soup followed by fish, followed by game, followed by pudding, then fruit, coffee, and liqueur. But down below, past the servants' stairwell and around the corner from the laundry drying lines, the meal looked rather different. Overcooked cabbage, gruel made from barley that had sat in the storeroom too long, a stew whose meat had been picked off bones too many times. And still, for many, it was the only hot meal they'd get all day. Breakfast was usually cold porridge or yesterday's roll. Lunch might be skipped entirely during busy seasons. Supper was everything. It wasn't called dinner, not really. In the servants' hall, it was simply supper, and even the name suggested something modest. Supper was taken in shifts. The higher-ranked staff, housekeeper, butler, valets ate first, sitting with upright backs, eating in near silence. The food itself was not poisoned, nor was it intentionally cruel. It was just tired. There was a rule, unspoken but strictly enforced, that servants did not complain about the food aloud. You ate what you were given. Occasionally, there were moments of fortune. But even these little blessings came with risk. Food was political. And yet, somehow, bonds were formed over those meager meals. Someone always managed to get the tea water just right. One girl, a chambermaid named Lot, once brought a folded napkin to supper. Not for show, but because her mother had sewn it before she left the countryside. Illness was often linked to food. Spoiled butter, old milk, bread too long gone dry. But no one had the luxury of dietary concern. Holidays brought little change. The most painful part wasn't always the food itself, but how close real food was. Sometimes a cook took pity. Hunger, for many servants, wasn't a sensation that came and went. It was a constant presence. Not the sharp kind that twisted the stomach suddenly, but the slow, dull ache of never quite being full. It followed them through the day when they carried trays past steaming platters, when they lifted lids from silver tureens thick with aroma, when they stood silently behind chairs as nobles dined on roast pheasant and duck and cherry glaze. You could become used to hunger. That was the strange part. And sometimes those dreams hurt more than the hunger itself. A senior footman might receive a slice of roast on a holiday, folding napkins into triangles, wiping bowls dry before use, saying a quiet word of thanks, not loudly, and not for show, but under the breath, like a habit passed from mother to daughter. Some brought spoons from home, passed down or found at market stalls. A personal spoon was more than metal. Upstairs, they poured wine from crystal. Downstairs, the staff shared water from a chipped pitcher. Upstairs, laughter echoed through halls, adorned with flowers and silver. Downstairs, someone wept quietly in the corner of the scullery because there wasn't enough to go around. But beneath every golden plate ever lifted by candlelight, there was a girl scrubbing pots in the dark, a boy carrying trays on legs that shook from hunger, a cook turning broth made of bones into something vaguely edible. They were the invisible hands behind every meal, and their own supper. It was rarely more than bread, gruel, and scraps, but it was theirs. It was a piece of identity, something to remind you that you were still yourself in a place that often tried to strip that away. Because pride, once swallowed, was easier to digest than guilt. And because in rare moments, someone showed kindness. The kitchen staff might be allowed scraps from pastry dough. A cook, gruff and impossible, sometimes tucked extra broth into a girl's bowl when no one was watching. A scullery maid saved orange peels in her apron pocket for a hall boy who had never tasted fruit. These were small things, but they mattered. In a world where food was rationed by rank and kindness was measured in crumbs, such gestures were the difference between despair and endurance. Who could guess what scraps would come down that day? To serve luxury while starving, there was no dignity in that. You placed roast pork on a guest plate and bowed while your own belly twisted. You wiped gravy from their cups while remembering you hadn't had oil in your stew since last month. You folded napkins embroidered with golden thread and knew your only meal had been boiled barley. You cleared plates half full of untouched food, discarded not because it wasn't good, but because it had been eclipsed by something better. Who could carry a tray upstairs and return without a crumb smuggled in a pocket? Who could sneak a plum pit from the compost and plant it by the wall, hoping foolishly it might grow? They weren't dreams of abundance, just tiny chances at change. The housekeeper and butler had their own cupboard, locked, where they kept tea and sometimes jam. Everyone else knew to stay away. Stealing from that cupboard wasn't just theft, it was betrayal. One maid tried once, not even for herself, but for her sister who worked the outdoor washhouse and had fainted that morning. She was caught by the cook and let go before nightfall. No reference, no wages, no fare home, because they reminded them of what they once had or might never have again. A kitchen maid named Elsie, who had been orphaned young and taken into service by a vicar's wife, once said she hadn't had meat on her plate in 2 years, except for what clung to a soup bone. She chewed it slowly, scraping with her teeth, not for flavor, but because chewing felt like defiance. It settled into your bones until it became another part of you, like the bend in your back or the soot under your nails. There was no expectation that servants should be well fed. After all, they were not guests. They were not even really people in the eyes of the household. They were extensions of the furniture meant to operate with efficiency, not comfort. Meals were something to be earned, not enjoyed. And when food did arrive, it came in bowls still warm from the scullery, ladled hastily, barely salted, and often reheated too many times to retain flavor. Leftovers were routine, but not the leftovers you'd imagine. The upstairs food, when passed down, came stripped of meat, bones picked clean, sauces scraped, nearly dry. It was the suggestion of a meal, not a meal itself. One hall boy, thin, quiet, always running, once confided to an older maid that he'd learned to chew slower. To make his piece of bread last the whole of supper. If you eat quick, it goes, he said. If you pretend it's many bites, it feels like more. She didn't laugh. She just handed him half of her potato, and they never spoke of it again. Hunger crept into the dreams of the youngest servants. They dreamed of baskets full of warm rolls, pies that never ended, soups that refilled themselves. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was status. Who ate what, when, and where marked your rank almost more than your uniform. There were rituals to make the food feel more like a meal. There were games too, not playful ones, but survival ones. And yet, the true weight of food was emotional. The worst days were the ones with banquets. Not because the work was harder, though it was, but because the contrast was too sharp. Still, they continued. Not from contentment, but from habit, because there were mouths to feed elsewhere. Because leaving meant starvation? One butler, stern but not cruel, once left a warm biscuit on Amada's bench when she was too ill to eat with the others. Even now, when people speak of grand Viennese manors, they speak of the chandeliers, the polished floors, the glittering soirees. Chapter 7. The mysterious music of the disappeared composer. It was not unusual, in the grand homes of 19th century Vienna, for music to drift through the walls like incense, the sound of a piano being tuned in the parlor, the soft tuning of a violin in a guest chamber. Music was a necessity for aristocratic life, entertainment, refinement, reputation. The more grand the household, the more prestigious the musician invited in. And sometimes, for special seasons, a composer would be brought in not merely to perform, but to create. Kiel stopped taking meals. It became dissonant. Not loud, not unpleasant, but eerie. Like a memory half forgotten. One piece in particular made the housemaids stop mid-step in the corridor. It seemed to follow them even after the last note faded. The governess said it reminded her of church bells heard underwater. The cook refused to go near the east wing if he was playing. 3 nights after his disappearance, someone or something played the piano, softly, just a few bars. Enough to stir the scullery maid from her cot. Enough to make the dog bark in the courtyard. The drawing room was empty, but the keys were still warm. They stopped using that piano after that, moved it to storage. Winding, cleaning, even replacing the mechanism. Nothing worked. It remained stuck at 347 for decades. When asked about it, the staff simply said, that's when the music ended. But even then, servants reported hearing fragments of the unfinished melody echoing faintly through the walls when the wind changed direction. His tea sat untouched. She hosted a string quartet for her winter soiree instead. The butler was told to remove all mention of the composer from the household ledgers. His things were eventually packed up and left with the city constable, who placed them in storage for a year before declaring them unclaimed. The maid who cleaned his room found pages scattered across the floor, dozens of them. The windows were open, though the air had turned cold. His coat remained draped over the settee. The grounds were swept. The stable boys questioned. The police summoned, though, without urgency. After all, he was not family, not nobility, just a guest. And a slightly odd one at that. Perhaps he had grown bored. Perhaps he had returned to the city. But none of his belongings were taken. His boots remained under the bed. His manuscript pages lay where they had fallen. The tea tray in his room was still full, the sugar beginning to crystallize in the bowl. And his folio still sat atop the piano, open to an unfinished score. No one saw him leave. No carriage was ordered. No note was left behind. By dinner time, the family assumed he was in his room. By nightfall, the staff assumed he had gone for a walk. By morning, the entire manor realized he was simply gone, all covered in the same musical phrase repeated over and over like an obsession. He refused the laundry maid entry, snapping at her in a tone none of the staff had heard before. The footman assigned to him claimed he no longer slept in his bed but passed out at the piano in the drawing room, fully dressed, the candle wax pooling at his feet. New music made to impress guests, to mark a wedding or birth, or to elevate the name of the family just a little higher among the nobility. And so it was in the autumn of 1841 when a composer named Matthias Kiel was hired to stay at the estate of Baroness von Dellenheim. He was not famous, not yet. Among the staff first, a kitchen maid said she'd seen him walking toward the riverbank at dawn 2 days before, barefoot. The gardener insisted he'd heard a strange melody coming from the woods just before sunrise. The housekeeper told the Baroness not to worry, creative types were always unpredictable, but she began locking her bedroom door at night anyway. But he had made a name for himself in a few salons across the city, rumored to be a student of Schubert in his final years. Praised for his ability to blend classical structure with something more emotional, something modern. The Baroness, who fancied herself a patron of the arts, wanted an original composition for her winter soiree. Kiel was to stay for 6 weeks. He arrived with 2 cases, a black coat worn thin at the elbows, and a leather folio filled with handwritten notes and partially finished scores. At first, things proceeded as expected. Kiel took his meals in the small guest salon, never with the family, but not in the servants' hall either. A kind of floating rank above the staff but beneath the family, just a few notes in the middle of the night. Then more cascading arpeggios, haunting chords, melodies that lingered in the corners of your mind hours after they were played. Servants heard it while sweeping halls. The family commented on it over breakfast. The Baroness beamed when her guests complimented the haunting nocturnes echoing through the manor after supper. "My composer," she would say proudly, as though he were a house cat or prize horse. "He's capturing the spirit of the season." He was quiet, polite, and strange in the way artists often are. He rose late, stayed up long after midnight, and requested tea at odd hours. The staff soon got used to his presence. The maids joked about his wild hair and absent stares. The butler assigned a junior footman to keep track of him, just in case he wandered into places he shouldn't. Then the music began, soft at first. But then things began to shift. By the end of the 3rd week, the music changed. Then, without notice, Kiel vanished. He was last seen on a Tuesday afternoon, seated at the piano in the second drawing room. The fire had burned out. A search was conducted. Whispers began, of course. The music, however, did not stop. That was the most unsettling part. The Baroness, embarrassed by the whole affair, never spoke of Kiel again. The only thing no one could explain was the clock. A small, ornate timepiece that sat atop the piano had stopped the day Kiel vanished. Precisely at 3:47 p.m., every effort to restart it failed. The absence of Matthias Kiel settled into the manor like dust in forgotten corners. After the official inquiries faded, after the Baroness stopped entertaining questions about her vanished composer, and after the piano was covered with a cloth and shoved into storage beside a stack of unused chairs, the household resumed its rhythm. Or at least it tried to. But something remained. Not loud, not visible. Just a thread of tension woven into the fabric of daily life, especially among the servants who had seen things more closely than the family ever would. The scullery maid refused to clean the drawing room alone. The youngest footman requested reassignment to the west wing. And the gardener, who had once worked in silence with nothing but the chirping of birds, began humming tunelessly whenever he passed the conservatory. The unfinished sheet music still spread across Kiel's folio was never claimed. It sat for weeks in the housekeeper's drawer until she, tired of servants' sneaking glances at it, finally tucked it into a cabinet and turned the key. But the melody lingered. A sharp-eared girl might notice it whistled absent-mindedly by another. A bored valet might tap its rhythm against the edge of a boot he was polishing. No one taught it. No one tried to remember it. And yet, they did. One of the strangest stories came months later, during the spring cleaning. A new maid, transferred from another house, had been sent to scrub the storage room. She worked in silence for hours, and then, just as she was rearranging a stack of faded linen covers, she reached the old piano. Out of curiosity or boredom, she lifted the cloth and ran her fingers gently over the keys. What she played was odd. A fragment, a phrase that made her pause. The notes had come to her unbidden. She didn't know the melody, and yet it flowed from her as if remembered. When she told the cook later that evening, the older woman went pale. "That's the one," she said. "That's his song." After that, the piano was moved again, this time to the cellar, and the key to the music cabinet was moved from the drawer to the butler's own pocket. Of course, not everyone believed. The governess scoffed at the notion of haunted melodies. The Baroness herself dismissed all talk of Kiel as artistic nonsense. He was clearly unwell, she declared one evening, swirling her wine. And besides, truly talented men don't vanish without leaving a legacy. But the servants weren't so sure. Legacy, in their world, wasn't carved in stone. It whispered down corridors, left impressions in candlelight, and sometimes lived on in things you couldn't explain. Years passed. Staff came and went. But certain things remained unchanged. The room where Kiel had stayed was never used for guests again. Too small was the official reason, though no one complained when assigned elsewhere. The piano was eventually sold off, but the maid who handled its departure said she heard a faint chord play as it was wheeled out, though no one else was in the room. Stranger still, one of the kitchen boys, barely 12, not yet educated, began doodling notes in the margins of his chores ledger. They matched one of Kiel's repeated motifs exactly. When asked where he learned it, he shrugged. "Just heard it," he said. "In a dream, I think." Not everyone noticed these things. The household, on the surface, remained respectable. Linen was ironed. Dinner was served. Letters were written. But those who paid attention saw the way the lamps flickered in the east corridor. The way cats refused to enter the former drawing room. The way the clock from Kiel's piano still stopped at 3:47 would occasionally chime once without prompting, then fall silent again for weeks. Some servants believed the composer had never truly left, that something of him remained in the house strap, perhaps, or simply unwilling to leave without finishing the piece he had begun. Others believed that the music itself had life. That once created, it couldn't be erased. That certain arrangements, certain harmonies echoed beyond their original performance, etched into wood and stone like breath on a mirror. One older maid, retired and long since gone from service, used to say it plainly. "The thing about music," she'd whisper, "is that once it's heard, it lives. And this one, it doesn't want to be forgotten." Long after the Baroness passed and the house changed hands, the stories persisted. New families moved in. Rooms were remodeled, servant quarters converted. But occasionally, a note in a guest book mentioned strange sounds at night. One woman, staying in what had once been Kiel's room, wrote that she dreamed of a man with ink-stained fingers playing a piano in the snow. She'd never heard of Matthias Kiel, and still the melody cropped up in humming, in tapping, in half-remembered lullabies. A refrain carried across decades, outliving the composer, the patron, even the piano itself. Matthias Kiel's name never reached the heights of Vienna's great masters. He left no published works, no portraits, no confirmed grave. But for those who'd lived in the manor, who'd heard the strange, tender sorrow of his music drifting up the stairwells, it didn't matter. Because sometimes in history, legacy isn't measured in fame or fortune. Sometimes it's measured in the quietest things. The creak of a floorboard at midnight, the whisper of a chord when no one's there, the feeling that something unfinished is still waiting to be played. Chapter 8. The Etiquette That Could Ruin Your Life. In a Viennese Manor. Etiquette wasn't simply a code of conduct, it was a force of nature, as pervasive and inescapable as the cold that crept in through stone walls each winter. It governed every glance, every gesture, every breath drawn between words. From the moment a new maid or footman entered the household, They were given instruction not in their work, which they were expected to already know, but in how to exist correctly in the presence of their betters. How to stand, back straight, eyes low but not closed, hands either clasped at the waist or held behind. How to walk, quietly, quickly, and never directly through the center of a room. Servants were expected to know things, schedules, preferences, where certain silverware was stored, but not to know too much. Repeating a guest's name in the wrong context was considered gossip. Knowing who stayed in which room last season was considered impertinent. Knowing when not to speak was often more valuable than knowing what to say. How to knock. 2 gentle raps, never more, never less. There was no patience for slow learners. The older staff sometimes gave gentle corrections. A noble woman once asked a maid to adjust a footstool, and the girl moved too quickly, accidentally brushing the hem of the lady's gown. Servants taught themselves to move silently, to freeze when uncertain, to rehearse tasks in their minds before performing them. Some practiced curtsies in private. Others whispered phrases aloud while polishing shoes. Yes, my lady. Right away, sir. Shall I bring fresh linen? Words meant to smooth over the edges of their presence. It was no more than a flick of cloth. But the guest drew back as if burned, and later asked the hostess if her staff had been properly trained. Knowing which spoon belonged to fish, which to pudding. Knowing when to speak and when to vanish. It was not applause-worthy. It was not rewarded, but it was survival. The girl was not dismissed. She was simply never assigned guest service again. She was seen less and less until one day she was gone. Other times, they watched silently, waiting to see if the new blood would survive. One wrong smile, one misstep and a curtsy, and you were marked. He did it softly, even respectfully. But that single moment merely stating the correct emphasis on a foreign syllable cost him his position. You didn't call across the room. You didn't fumble or whisper. You handed objects silently. Not flashy, not personal, but correct. A wrinkle could draw a reprimand. A missing button suggested sloppiness. Shoes were to be polished to the point of reflection, not because anyone noticed, but because it was assumed. There were no compliments when you looked right. But if you looked wrong, you heard about it. You moved in a choreography so precise it was practically invisible. 2 maids clearing a tea table moved like clockwork. One lifted the tray. The other collected napkins, neither interrupting the conversation around them. To pause, to drop something, to apologize too loudly was to fail. Not immediately. He was kept for another 2 weeks, his hours cut, his tasks made more menial, until finally the head butler informed him, in a voice as neutral as winter fog, that his services were no longer required. A count might slouch at dinner. A baroness might forget a name. But a maid who mispronounced viscount or set a spoon at the wrong angle during soup service was shamed without mercy. It was not about moral failure. It was about disrupting the illusion that the manor was a place of seamless perfection. No cause was given, none needed. The mistake had already done the work. And most importantly, how to disappear entering and leaving rooms like ghosts, unnoticed unless required, unseen unless summoned. For the family upstairs, etiquette was a symbol of refinement. For the servants below, it was a daily minefield, one misstep away from humiliation or dismissal. The rules started early. Mistakes weren't shouted at. That would have been too vulgar. Instead, a raised eyebrow might suffice, a slightly narrowed eye. Too much and you were considered insolent. Too little and you were suspicious or thought to be hiding something. A response longer than 10 words could be construed as chatty. A sentence with personal opinion might be seen as forward. A joke, no matter how harmless, was risky. One maid, attempting to lighten the mood after a spilled dish, quipped that perhaps the gravy missed the roast on purpose. The guest chuckled. The mistress did not. The maid was reassigned to linen folding in the attic. For 6 months, a valet who accidentally caught the gaze of a visiting count was sent to polish brass fixtures for a month, removed from all guest-facing duties. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because, as the housekeeper put it, he made himself visible. A word repeated slowly, deliberately, as though the listener were deaf or stupid. This is how we carry the silver, Murray. This is not how we greet guests, Yakko. The tone stung more than yelling ever could, because it wasn't just correction. It was a reminder of status. Eye contact was one of the most treacherous terrains. Speech was equally dangerous. Servants were expected to speak clearly, but briefly, courteously, but never familiarly. Even the content of speech mattered. There was a story, often repeated among the staff, of a footman who once corrected a nobleman's pronunciation of a Hungarian dish. Etiquette extended even to how servants handled each other in the presence of guests. Uniforms played their part too. A servant's dress or coat had to be pristine. This obsession with surface masked a deeper reality, that servants were often performing roles more rigid than the ones played by the nobility themselves. Training was mostly informal. A new servant watched the others and learned quickly. The most feared etiquette missteps were those committed in front of guests. And so etiquette became more than a system. It became instinct. There was a kind of pride in mastering it, knowing how to serve wine without noise. The cost of failing etiquette wasn't measured in shouted reprimands or lashes across the hand. It was subtler than that. Colder. One day you were visible, trusted with trays and tasks. She did not recoil. She froze for half a second. Just half a second too long. Enough for the guest to notice, enough for the mistress to glance up. Quiet. Suffocating pressure. Servants learn not only to regulate their bodies, but their thoughts. To smile without feeling it, to hold still when humiliated, to nod at orders that made no sense, to listen to criticisms from people who did nothing all day but read poetry and complain that the curtains didn't match the season. And that was it. One housemaid confessed that even years after leaving service, she could not sit at a dinner table without checking the cutlery arrangement. A scullery maid might spend hours rehearsing her tray walk in private, worrying not just about balance, but about angle, gait, posture. A valet could dress his master for a formal banquet in under 6 minutes cufflinks. Cravat, waistcoat, and watch chain. A cook's assistant could dice onions so finely the mistress once mistook them for pearls. These small triumphs mattered. They were private victories in a world that rarely noticed them. A footman might spend an evening memorizing guest names he'd never be introduced to, just to avoid seeming slow. A name scrubbed from the roster, a cot given to someone else, a plate no longer laid out at supper. They weren't learning how to be better people. They were learning how to be unnoticeable. And sometimes when everything was done perfectly, when the guest smiled without noticing the maid's hand trembling slightly, when the master nodded without comment, it almost felt like success. You had to be seen just not too much, heard just not too clearly, present just not in the way. It was a performance with no script, no intermission, and no applause. Another said she would wake at 5 a.m., long after she had no bell to answer. Because, for all its strictness, the household gave them food, shelter, even a sense of purpose. Because they had nowhere else to go. And because, within the rules, some found a kind of comfort, predictability, order, the knowledge that if they followed every step correctly, they might avoid shame for one more day. A former valet, once reprimanded for laughing in a corridor, never spoke above a whisper again, not even to his own wife. But now and then, late at night, in the laundry room or behind the stables, stories slipped out. A maid who bit her tongue so often it developed a permanent scar. A boy who practiced smiling in a mirror because he'd once been told his resting face was unpleasant. Another who went mute for weeks after a public scolding in front of a duke and 3 guests. No scene, no raised voice. Just a quiet transfer the next morning. Greta was sent to manage bootlaces and polish doorknobs. 3 months later, she left. Her final wages were short, deducted for a chip saucer she hadn't broken, called by name. The next, you were someone others avoided making eye contact with. Your name might still appear on the roster, but fewer assignments came. Your seat in the servants' hall grew more distant. Eventually, you weren't asked to polish silver anymore, only to scrub floors. You weren't sent upstairs, only to the cellar. Until finally someone pulled you aside and said gently that you no longer suited the household standards. All for a smile held too long, a mispronounced title, a delay in responding to a bell. One of the most quietly tragic stories was of Greta, a parlor maid with impeccable record and steady hands. For nearly 3 years, to move through each moment with a kind of effortless grace that belied the grinding effort it took to maintain it, you had to pretend you weren't tired. Pretend you didn't notice cruelty. Pretend that nothing you did was hard. She served tea every afternoon in the drawing room, with precision that was almost poetic. She placed the sugar bowl always at a slight angle by request of the mistress and never spilled a drop. Then, one afternoon, a new guest arrived. A gentleman from Berlin with a dramatic mustache and a habit of speaking to servants as if they were deaf. When Greta offered the sugar tongs, he jokingly took her hand instead. She did not laugh. It wasn't that anyone expected servants to be perfect. They expected them to perform perfection. There was pressure in that. Some internalized the rules so deeply they forgot how to relax. Etiquette shaped more than their daily lives. It shaped their minds. And yet the weight of it wore them down. Servants didn't talk openly about the toll. To do so would imply weakness, and weakness invited replacement. And yet, even in the face of this, they returned to work each day with their collars stiff and their shoes shining. Why? Because etiquette was survival? Because the world beyond the manor walls was no kinder, only more indifferent. Some grew proud of their precision. A maid once said she could carry a tray with a single hand while balancing a glass vase and not spill a drop. But for every servant who succeeded, another quietly failed. And the punishment for failure wasn't just demotion, it was erasure. In the end, it was the weight of visibility and invisibility. And yet, they performed it day after day, year after year. Because there was no other stage and no other life available to them. Chapter 9. Chamber pots and secret doors. Behind every grand hallway in a Viennese manor, behind the velvet curtains, the glinting chandeliers, the delicate fragrance of imported flowers, lay a world rarely acknowledged by those who lived above. A second architecture, woven through the manor like a secret thread, narrow staircases that twisted behind walls, doors concealed behind tapestries, passages so low and dark that a tall man had to crouch to pass. Servants were to move swiftly and silently, without disrupting the illusions of noble life. One might work for 10 years in the same home and never be seen entering or exiting a guest room. Doors were hidden in wood paneling. Pantry access points sat behind false bookshelves. Even the scullery had a hatch that led to a small tunnel where waste could be quietly removed without passing through the main corridor. But many still required manual transport. Young servants carried brimming pots down staircases too narrow for proper balance, praying they wouldn't trip. Chamber pot duty was a reminder of one's position, a statement that your time, your body, your dignity could be devoted to carrying someone else's filth without thanks. A noble woman might leave behind a mess that required scrubbing, then remark over breakfast that the flowers in the hallway looked tired. The servant who had emptied her pot was never acknowledged. A fall down a narrow back stair could break a wrist or worse. And if you were hurt badly enough to stop working, there was no safety net, no pension, no thanks. You were simply replaced. A slip meant more than humiliation. It meant punishment. A patch of stolen sunlight from a window no guest ever looked through. A cracked mirror hidden behind a water basin where a maid might glance at her own reflection just long enough to remember her name. A maid might rise before dawn, strip beds, fetch water, polish mirrors, then clear a row of pots without blinking. Who was arriving? Who was leaving? Which guests drank too much? Which family members no longer slept in the same room? Secrets dripped down through the house like wax from a candle, never spoken, only seen. And the servants, silent as ghosts, carried them all. They reinforced the boundary between servant and served, between the curated performance upstairs and the gritty labor beneath. You might walk past your employer every day and never be seen. If you did speak, it was from a corridor with uneven stone underfoot, looking up toward someone whose shoes you had polished only hours earlier. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She had learned to disassociate, to be present without absorbing what she saw or smelled or touched. It was self-preservation of the highest order. Or worse, being permanently assigned to waste duty, a role so despised that Some servants wept when told they had been rotated in. These hidden paths were practical, but they also reminded every servant exactly who they were. A footman once carved his initials into the underside of a staircase. Step one of the few places he felt private enough to express the fact that he existed. A maid used to leave small scraps of poetry behind the paneling where she dusted. She never signed them. Perhaps she just wanted her words to live somewhere beyond the linen closet. This was the servant's domain, the house beneath the house. It was designed not for comfort or safety, but for invisibility. Aristocrats didn't soil themselves with details. They rang a bell, the pot was emptied, the smell was gone. In winter, the waste froze before it could be cleaned. In summer, the heat made it unbearable. Gloves were rare, cloth masks, even rarer. A maid might breathe through her apron or hold a pinch of mint under her nose, but the stench clung anyway. On her skin, in her hair. And if she was unlucky, in her dreams. But for the maid or footman on duty, it was a daily task both filthy and fraught with social risk. It had to be done quickly, quietly, and with impeccable discretion. You didn't carry a chamber pot like a bucket. You wrapped it in a cloth, held it low, and avoided eye contact. If someone saw you, they pretended not to. If you dropped it, God help you. And among the least glamorous, yet most essential, duties in this hidden world was the chamber pot. In an age before widespread indoor plumbing, chamber pots were a necessity for every bedroom in the house. The contents were dumped into outdoor pits or privy trenches, often behind the stable yards. Some manors had elaborate systems of waste removal, with floor hatches leading to vertical shafts. It wasn't just about the physical task. It was about what it meant. Yet somehow these tasks were normalized, folded into the rhythm of the day. The secret doors and passages weren't just practical, they were psychological. Not all the secrets behind those doors were foul-smelling or foul-tempered. Some passages offered escape. A quiet moment to breathe. A place to weep where no one would hear. Some of these secret spaces also carried danger. Dim lighting and tight turns meant injuries were common. But still, these spaces were claimed in small ways by those who moved through them. A bit of lavender tucked into a dark corner. And there was knowledge, too, passed through these secret places. Servants learned early that the dirtiest tasks often revealed the most truth. The world above might sparkle with clean gloves and pressed linens, but down below, they knew where the stains were. Sometimes literal, sometimes not. Because when you carry out someone's waste each morning, you came to know them in ways their closest companions never would. You saw signs of illness before the doctor was called. You noticed changes in appetite and digestion and routine. A chamber pot was more than a vessel. It was a mirror of habits, vices, and secrets no nobleman ever imagined being read. And the servants read them, quietly, without comment. But they noticed. There was a cook's helper named Rudy who could tell when the Baron had been drinking heavily just by the weight of the pot in the morning. A chambermaid once whispered to another that the Baroness had begun discarding small bits of fabric into her own waste basin torn lace. Scorched ribbon ends, as if destroying pieces of herself. No one mentioned it, but the housekeeper began scheduling more frequent visits from the lady's maid. These small observations, pieced together, created a map of the house's emotional weather, long before it broke into storm. It was in these hidden corridors and unseen tasks that the servants became, quietly, the most informed people in the house. They knew which windows rattled before a storm, which floorboard creaked just outside the study, which footsteps belonged to the heir, and which to the chamberlain's niece. They could recognize perfume by scent before its wearer entered a room. They could tell when guests were about to quarrel, simply from the way a tea tray was rearranged or a fork replaced too loudly on a plate. This intelligence was never acknowledged. But it made them invaluable, not in name, not in wage, but in the subtle way the house continued to function, in how it avoided disaster, in how dignity was preserved for those above. Still, the psychological toll of invisibility ran deep. A young maid, assigned to chamber pot duty for the third month in a row, once confessed she no longer felt disgust. She felt nothing at all. Not pride, not shame, just numbness. "I've become part of the wall," she said. I move and clean and empty and no one sees me. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. She wasn't dismissed. She wasn't comforted. She was sent back to work. Others resisted in small, nearly imperceptible ways. One scullery girl carved a tiny flower into the underside of each chamber pot she handled, using a knife borrowed from the bread counter. She said it was to remind herself that even filth deserved beauty. No one noticed the carvings. She didn't care. It was enough that they existed. And then there were the doors. Doors that led to nowhere or to places no one ever spoke of. A hallway behind the wine cellar that ended in a bricked wall. A trapdoor beneath the pantry that revealed nothing but earth. Some said these were remnants of older buildings. Others believed they had been intentionally created for escape or secrecy or shame. Rumors, of course, flourished. That an old governess once used it to spy. That a disgraced heir had used it to sneak in and out of the house. That it was built for lovers or thieves or worse. The family said nothing. The housekeeper warned the staff not to speak of it. And yet, once in a while, servants would leave small tokens inside. Pebbles, ribbons, even a coin, just to see if they disappeared. Most did. Despite the strangeness, despite the decay and filth, the servants made these spaces their own. In the broom cupboard beneath the main stairs, a maid had scratched the names of every girl who had trained her, and every girl she had trained. So they don't vanish, she said. So someone remembers us. In a shaft behind the linen closet, 2 footmen stored notes, dumb jokes, observations, warnings about guests with wandering hands. It was their way of looking out for each other in a world that didn't. These gestures didn't change the hierarchy. They didn't bring comfort, not really, but they created a thread of resistance. A way of saying, we see this, we live this, we endure. And sometime those who entered the house from the outside, guests, visitors, even new hires, sensed it. The strange quiet of the manor, the way the walls seemed to listen, the way a tray arrived before it was called for, or a door opened just as someone reached for it. They called it good service. But it was more than that. It was memory, awareness, the invisible coordination of those who moved like shadows, not just following rules, but shaping the world without being seen. In time, some of the secret passages were sealed. The back staircases fell into disrepair. Indoor plumbing made chamber pots obsolete, but the marks remained. A scratch behind the baseboard, a flower carved into the side of a forgotten basin, an old name etched in charcoal beneath a stair tread. And in the silence of those abandoned spaces, you could still feel it, that faint pulse of presence. Of people who had moved through this world not to be remembered, but refusing to be forgotten. Chapter 10, Whispered Romances Below the Stairs. There was very little softness in a servant's life. Days were long, meals were spare, and dignity was always one polite misstep away from being revoked. Courtship was seen as a distraction from duties, an invitation for drama. Some employers feared scandal. Others feared pregnancy. And a few simply didn't like the idea of their footmen and maids thinking they were entitled to lives of their own. And yet, in the long hours of labor and silence, love still found its way in. Not the grand, operatic kind sung about upstairs. Not at first. They said, he's kind or she's clever. They joked about bad stitching or heavy boots. A chambermaid caught with a hall boy behind the pantry was dismissed by morning, her wages held. The boy was sent to the stables, then quietly let go 2 weeks later. No warning, no farewell, just gone. A valet who was caught sneaking a letter to the housemaid he fancied was reassigned to overnight shifts outdoors, rain, snow, or shine, for a full season. Love between 2 maids, or between 2 boys. Hidden so carefully that it lived only in glances and brief touches and shadowed corners. 2 people might sit on opposite ends of the servants' hall, separated by rules and fear and duty, but connected by something older than any of those things. Something that could not be polished away or folded into a uniform. Step closer and step away, and let their hands linger for just a moment longer than the rules allowed. Nothing acknowledged, nothing recorded, but real, all the same. No one said why. Everyone knew. They passed notes tucked in the folds of aprons or hidden behind cupboard doors. And sometimes that pretense would last a lifetime. And so romance became a language of caution. Two cups left side by side on a table. The way one stood a little too close when handing off a letter. Suspicion spread quickly among servants, and those who were caught faced not only punishment from their employers, but from their peers who feared they might bring shame or scrutiny down on everyone. A pair of boots placed near each other, but never quite touching. For most servants, marriage was a distant dream. Courtship was not practiced in the halls of the manor. Time was measured in tasks, not tenderness. And so, even the smallest moments an apple left on a shelf, a song hummed in harmony became treasure. Conversations in code. One couple, known among staff but never confirmed aloud. A maid who waited too long for a letter that never came. A cook's assistant who watched the footman she loved marry another. A stable boy who left for military service, promising to return, only for word to arrive months later that he had died of fever on the Eastern Front. His name was never written in the family records. Only on the inside of a maid's apron, where she stitched it by hand, one night by candlelight. Always said, "The tea's too strong," when someone was nearby. It meant, "Don't speak now." Wait until later. They used it for years. One maid, Rosa, left bits of embroidery floss in the stairwell for a footman who carved wooden buttons in secret. Each color meant something. Red for bravery, green for luck. When the footman and a maid saved wages quietly, married in secret, and left the household together to start new lives. These were rare, but they happened. Some went to smaller houses as a pair. Others opened bakeries, inns, or simply disappeared into the swell of the city, free for the first time to speak freely, to hold hands in daylight. Yellow for affection. They never said a word about it, but by spring, the maid was wearing one of his buttons at her wrist. Not the kind with carriages and courtships and family names passed in sealed letters, but quieter forms, brief glances, shared warmth in a corridor, fingers brushing as trays passed between hands. Below stairs, romance was never safe. It wasn't even encouraged. Most households had strict rules forbidding relationships between staff. Still, it happened. It began in subtle ways. A footman offering to carry an extra coal scuttle for a laundry girl. A scullery maid slipping a heel of bread to the hall boy when he looked too pale. Small, necessary acts, passed off as nothing, but often something more. Because when you spent every hour in controlled silence, under someone else's rule, affection became an act of rebellion. They didn't call it love. There were secret meeting places passed down like recipes. Behind the second hay cart in the stable yard, the alley between the laundry house and the coal shed. The space beneath the eaves where the roof sloped too low for adults to bother with. These were not places for grand declarations, just for breathing together. For saying, "I see you," in a world where you were rarely seen. But the risks were real. The fear of discovery was constant. Still, even the most careful pairs were sometimes betrayed by simple things. A smile held too long. A touch on the sleeve. And yet, against the rules, the consequences, and the silence, they continued, because what else was there? There were times when it bloomed, and there were heartbreaks too. Some romances were never spoken at all, because love, even when forbidden, has a way of surviving. There were nights when, after the day's noise had faded, and the lamps had been extinguished, they would rise the next day and return to their roles. Pretend nothing lingered in the air between them. But sometimes, just sometimes, the world turned in their favor. And when it did, two people who had passed each other in silence for years might finally pause in the corridor. In the servants' world, romance was stitched together with risk and silence. There was no privacy, no space to speak openly. Everything unfolded under the eyes of others, whether fellow staff, suspicious housekeepers, or the ever-listening walls of the manor. A butler, stern and orderly, might go 10 years without saying the name of the woman he once loved, though every Sunday he placed her favorite biscuits on the tea tray. A kitchen maid might avoid the corridor near the scullery, not because it was damp, but because she once kissed someone there and the memory burned worse than the cold. These weren't grand heartbreaks. They were quieter things, but no less real. Not because they expected fairy tales, but because even the small human right to care for someone was often stripped away. In its place, they were told to focus on tasks. Iron shirts, wash silver, peel carrots, forget the feeling. Love had to be disguised as routine. A shared chore. A folded napkin left at a certain angle. A dish wiped twice instead of once. A candle burned 1 inch shorter than usual. These quiet romances bloomed into full partnerships. A cook and a butler, known to bicker during the day, were once caught laughing over pickled onions in the pantry late at night. Not by much. But occasionally, a servant marriage was allowed. A day off granted. A pair of staff given adjoining quarters small gestures, but gestures nonetheless. If you listen in the quiet spaces where old wood creaks and dust settles like memories, you might sense it, quietly, carefully, but always forward. That lingering warmth. The trace of a stolen kiss, long since faded, but once enough to make someone smile after a brutal shift. And in these moments, love steps slightly into the light. When asked what the fuss was about, they claimed it was about the spice blend. They eventually left service together and opened a small cafe on the edge of Vienna. They served tea with ginger biscuits and kept a copy of house rules nailed on the wall with a note underneath. No rules in love. These codes held meaning, passed only between two people, and meant nothing to anyone else. It was the only privacy they had. Not walls or doors or time, but meaning disguised as routine. He fell in love with a chambermaid named Lena, who had never once spoken above a murmur, but always smelt faintly of rosemary soap, but her fury was immediate. Not because of the poetry. Sometimes love offered more than hardship. It offered solidarity. The exposure of your heart in a world that demanded you remain invisible. It was being known too much by the wrong person, or not enough by the right one, and yet it persisted. Because despite the risk, affection made the hard days bearable. It reminded them they were human, not just hands and backs and eyes trained to look downward, but people, full, aching people. The strength to endure another 10-hour day. The comfort of being remembered, even if not acknowledged. A kitchen boy named Emil once left for military duty during the spring floods. Before he left, the laundress pressed a handkerchief with his initials and gave it to the chambermaid he'd favored. She didn't cry. She tucked it into her apron pocket and carried it for years. He never returned, but the handkerchief did not fade. She died with it beneath her pillow. But because it had been written by someone about someone else in her employ, using language she considered the realm of the elite. A high-ranking servant might use charm to manipulate a new hire. Jealousy sparked arguments that spilled into shifts in duties. Pregnancies occurred, and punishments fell disproportionately on women. A housemaid once vanished overnight, and no one ever said where she went. Her name was erased from the logbook. But in the servants' hall, her absence lingered louder than any bell. Jakob was dismissed by breakfast. Lena was not. She remained for 2 more seasons, but never looked the same. Her quietness became hollow. She smiled less. She moved slower. The rosemary smell disappeared. They weren't reckless. They were careful, thoughtful, never seen alone. And yet, one evening, the lady of the house discovered a crumpled poem behind her writing desk. It wasn't signed, but it spoke of eyes like polished chestnuts in morning light and referenced the laundry room by name. A longer glance than necessary when handing off folded linens. A pause on the back stairs that might have just been a rest, unless you knew to look closely. And so, feelings were buried beneath layers of habit and duty. One of the more whispered about stories involved a man named Jakob, a young groom with a soft voice and coal-dusted hands. The poem wasn't even meant for her. It had been carried by accident in a bundle of linens. These emotional casualties littered the lives of many below the stairs. But feelings do not disappear on command. So they found other ways to express them. Some wrote their own languages. In rare cases, but even for those who remained in service, it's important to say that many romances were not happy. Power imbalances crept in. The danger of love below the stairs was not just dismissal, it was humiliation. Toward the end of the century, as whispers of workers' rights grew louder in cities and railways carried news faster than ever, some households began to soften their rules. There are still homes today where initials are carved beneath stairs, where old tools bear two sets of fingerprints worn smooth by time. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of all. In the strictest of places, under the heaviest of rules, love still found a way to move. Chapter 11. A Royal Ball Beneath Glittering Chandeliers. By the time the final waltz echoed across the parquet floor, most of the guests felt victorious. Their performances were complete gowns admired, reputations polished, alliances hinted at. But for the servants it was far from over. The real work had just begun. Like stagehands after the curtain dropped, they were expected to erase all evidence that anything had ever happened. The glasses must vanish. The candles must be replaced. The flowers must be disposed of before they wilted. It was said that no ball was truly successful until it had ruined someone's shoes. But what wasn't said was that it also ruined someone's knees, someone's back, and someone's patience. That someone would slip carrying a tray of duck fat. Someone would gash a finger on a shattered flute. Someone would burn a sleeve reaching too fast for a tray near open flame. These were not accidents. They were inevitabilities. A girl named Greta once burned her hand badly while replacing candles between dances. She didn't cry. She didn't even shout. She simply slipped her handkerchief around it and kept moving. The next day, when her hand was too swollen to hold a brush, the housekeeper accused her of laziness. Greta was moved to kitchen duty, which involved heavier lifting, fewer breaks, and more scalding water. Her burn never healed properly. It cracked in the winter. She never said another word about it. This was the quiet violence of such nights. Not the kind that spilled blood, but the kind that wore a person down. The body gave a little more than it had. The mind ached with exhaustion, but wasn't allowed rest. The feet blistered, and then kept walking. And in all this, a strange sort of pride often emerged. Not out of vanity, but survival. You did it. You survived the ball. You moved like mist through marble. You made everything look effortless. There were moments of tenderness, too, but they were few. A footman steadying a tray for a maid whose hands were shaking. A kitchen porter slipping a boiled egg into someone's apron pocket when they hadn't eaten since dawn. These gestures mattered. They were quiet affirmations that even in such an unforgiving environment, humanity was not entirely lost. Still, mistakes were punished, and not always fairly. A spilled drink on the Count's daughter's dress sparked a fury that rippled through 3 departments. The maid who had handed the glass to the waiter was blamed, even though the Count's daughter had flailed during a joke. The maid was demoted. The waiter was reassigned. The Count's daughter was praised for her patience. The stain, in the end, came out easily. But the damage was done. Servants learned to take blame like seasoning and soup stirred in. Accepted, swallowed. Resistance was rare. Those who questioned orders were labeled difficult. Those who cried were weak. Those who spoke out rarely stayed long. Most simply endured, waiting for the guests to leave, for the house to sleep again, for the silence to return. After the ballroom was stripped bare. Music sheath packed. Musicians paid and dismissed. Tables folded and removed. Flowers dumped into sacks. Ribbons untied, swept up, thrown away. The shimmer vanished like illusion, leaving behind only the dull throb of work. Yet for the servants who had carried it all, there was something surreal about the transformation. One minute it was Versailles. The next it was a storage room. The ballroom itself held echoes. You could feel it if you stood there alone, the morning after. The warmth that lingered in the floorboards, the faint perfume in the curtains. The drag marks from chairs, the wax spills that hadn't yet been scraped. A room that had roared with opulence now felt hollow. Its grandeur drained away like champagne down a marble sink. Some servants walked through it quietly, just to see it empty, not as a statement, but out of curiosity. They wanted to see what was left once the lords and ladies had vanished. Often, it was nothing but silence. Sometimes, though, it was something more: a dropped earring, a half-written dance card, a handkerchief embroidered with a name. These were never returned, they were kept discreetly. Not for profit, but as proof that they had existed in that world, even if only at its margins. One butler, long retired, once said that during a ball, servants became invisible furniture. We're chairs that move, he chuckled. We're candelabras that refill the punch. But then he paused and more quietly added, still, we see everything. Because they did. They saw how Lady Winterfell drank her nerves before each entrance, how the Marquis of Albrecht smoothed his mustache 3 times before speaking, how the young heir practiced his jokes before each toast, whispering them to himself in the mirror. They saw fear, ambition, loneliness, vanity, love, even. The truth is, while the aristocrats danced, their lives were exposed. And the only ones who truly noticed were the ones trained to disappear. At the end of the night, servants filed out one by one. Some went to clean the stables, some to the laundry. A few, if lucky, to the cramped bedrolls that passed for sleep. The stars were always out by then, the fog creeping in from the river. And in those last quiet minutes, they allowed themselves the rarest indulgence of all a breath. A long, uninterrupted breath. The kind not measured by task or order, just air, taken in and released in the stillness before the house woke again. And if in those moments, one happened to twirl once in the empty ballroom to mimic the dance they had only ever served, there was no harm in it. The chandeliers wouldn't tell. The marble wouldn't judge. And the echoes of the waltz were just for a moment theirs. Chapter 12, Fires, Fleas, and Frozen Fingers. Long before the brass was polished or the gowns laid out for the day. Long before the house creaked to life with footfalls and orders. The servants were already fighting their first and oldest enemy, the cold. It clawed down the stone corridors of the manor like a living thing. Those belonged to the masters and guests who sat before them with steaming cups and fur-lined slippers. Below stairs, the hearths were smaller, stingier, and often filled with yesterday's ashes. Coal was rationed, wood was damp, and matches were counted. It seeped into linens, stiffened water in the buckets, and made every surface bite at the skin. In the linens that hung too long to dry, fleas were common. Bedbugs not rare. Rats were nightly visitors, bold enough to gnaw through soap if the bread was kept too high. A scullery maid once awoke with bites along her neck and was blamed for unclean habits, though it was well known the bedding in the lower quarters had not been boiled since Easter. Brass rails had to gleam even while frost nipped at the nose. The kitchen hearth was wide and cruel, blazing at the edges, but never enough to warm the feet. Cooks and assistants moved constantly, not out of hurry, but to keep blood flowing. Still, chilblains were common. Bread that cracked from dryness, cheese that smelled of cellar, soup that steamed but never warmed. They called it gut coal. Cheap food meant only to keep the fire inside alive a little longer. There were moments of shared defiance. A valet once allowed a chambermaid to stand near the guest fire as she polished a shoe. He was scolded when caught, but she remembered the warmth for days. Even the smallest flicker of kindness was enough to thaw something deeper than fingers. So were burns from steam, oil, or cast iron pots. Winter was only part of the burden. Summer brought flies, sweat, and the stench of cloaks stored too long. Autumn brought mud and endless sweeping, but winter lingered. It stiffened joints, shortened tempers, and made every task a trial. Still, the house ran. The tea was hot. The guests were comfortable. That one floor above, tapestries blocked drafts and feet rested on velvet cushions, while below, a maid wrapped rags around her feet because her socks had worn thin. One assistant nearly lost her eyebrows lighting a stubborn stove. She returned to work by evening. Hair had to be neatly tied back, uniforms spotless, fingernails clean. Back straight, hands behind their backs, faces impassive. No matter the chill that gnawed their toes or the ice that formed on inside panes. The nobleman would say, "Catch me a warmer shawl." And the servant would bow, fetch it, and never once mention that her own fingers were too numb to feel the fabric. Some were so tight one had to turn sideways to pass. Others dipped or twisted so suddenly that spills were inevitable. In winter, they became wind tunnels. If the family wanted hot tea in the upstairs drawing room, it meant a 15-minute journey through frozen stone and tight corners, balancing a tray that trembled with every step. One butler trained a footman for a week to carry trays without clinking. The footman lasted a month before frostbite ended service. No matter that water turned to ice in the pails, or that fingers bled quietly beneath gloves. He would shuffle through frost-laced halls, hands numb, knees aching, and pray the chimney wouldn't belch smoke. The smell was sharp lard soap, ash, damp cloth. It filled the nostrils and clung to skin. Afterward, the linens had to be wrung dry by hand, no matter how red or cracked the fingers had become. One girl fainted once while wringing sheets. The matron said she lacked character. If it did, he'd be accused of incompetence. If the room was too cold, he'd be blamed for negligence. If it was too warm, extravagance. The perfect fire was invisible. It was only noticed when it failed. Cold was the first sensation of the day and the last to leave. In winter, it never truly left. There were fires in the great halls, yes, marble hearths taller than a grown man. But those were not for the servants. To warm a room for the family took planning. A footman might rise at 4 a.m. just to ensure the fire was lit before the mistress stirred. And cold was only part of it. The manor was alive with things that crawled. In the hay bales near the stables, in the floorboards of the scullery, boiling was the only defense. Linens were dragged to the basement, stuffed into copper vats, and stirred like soup. And yet, the expectations never eased. Shoes were to be shined until reflections appeared in the toes, even if they were soaked through from slush. Those in the kitchens fared no better. The irony of standing beside a fire while still being cold was lost on no one. Then there were the passages, the narrow, secret arteries of the manor used only by servants. They were built for discretion, not comfort. And while nobles dined on beef and cream, the servants ate hastily in the cold. Meals were taken in shifts, often standing. It wasn't just the weather that chilled the bones. It was the knowledge that warmth was so near and still so far. Still, a kitchen boy once smuggled hot chestnuts into the linen room. The warmth lasted minutes, but the smell lingered, and the story lasted the week. And yet, because the servants were not allowed to be cold, not in front of the family, they would stand. That was the quiet rule of the manor. Comfort for some, cost for others. To speak of cold in a 19th century manor was not just to speak of discomfort. It was to speak of wear and tear on bodies, minds, and even time itself. For the servants, cold wasn't seasonal, it was structural. It crept into joints until they no longer bent smoothly. It settled into the lungs and lingered, sometimes for life. It made mornings longer and nights feel like punishment. A valet might bend over to tie a boot in January and struggle to stand fully until March. You'd see it in their hands first. The elder maids especially, often in silence. Fingers red and cracked, knuckles swollen from decades of washing in icy water. No one ever saw her place them, but every morning they were there. When asked, she shrugged. Even the grand halls, when empty, seemed to echo with chill. They complained of the inconvenience of sleet or the misery of slushy streets. They never once spoke of how it felt to chip ice from a well at dawn, or to light a fire with hands too stiff to strike the match. Few had families who could support them. Fewer still had homes to return to, with feet tucked close and hands curled beneath chins. The cold followed them into their dreams. One valet joked he could smell frost before it arrived. Another claimed he'd grown calluses on his soul. The manor was cruel, yes, but it offered food, routine, and the illusion of order, even when it hurt them. Their comfort was purchased with invisible effort. Warm bathwater did not appear by magic. And the kind of resilience that never made it into history books, but it was there, in the silent halls, in the worn gloves, in the way a servant learned to light a fire, not just to warm a room, but to remind themselves they were still alive. It was boiled, pail by pail, carried up 3 flights, and poured in silence. One servant said walking through the unlit ballroom felt like walking through the belly of a sleeping beast fast, echoing, and entirely indifferent to your presence. The maid, not permitted to speak without invitation, simply curtsied. The countess gave her a shilling, a grand gesture to her. The maid used it to buy bread for two, said it was probably a leak in the pipes. Everyone knew she was lying. No one corrected her. Wet socks meant frostbite. There was a boy no older than 12 tasked with sweeping snow from the manor steps every morning. One day he arrived late. A second pair of socks secretly stitched from an old apron. One winter, the master of the house insisted on an outdoor luncheon, despite the snow. Servants spent 6 hours preparing a tented garden feast while dressed in layers of wool and desperation. By evening, 2 had collapsed from cold. One was reprimanded for doing so within view of the guests. A flask passed quietly between coal workers. A moment stolen near the guest fireplace, pretending to dust a mantle. If caught, there was punishment. But if timed well, these flickers of warmth could carry a person through a week. His feet had blackened overnight. The steward docked his pay, calling it carelessness. The boy was never seen again, though his broom remained in the corner for years. They rubbed ointments made from animal fat and herbs, but nothing truly softened them again. One maid, Ilsa, used to hum while she worked. A low tune like a lullaby she couldn't quite remember. In her final winter of service, she stopped. Her fingers had stiffened so badly she could no longer fold napkins to the standard the mistress required. She was quietly dismissed, and the song disappeared with her. Feet were next. Servants rarely had proper boots. Often, what they wore had been passed down, repaired with scraps, stuffed with wool when holes appeared. And yet, illness was never an excuse. Fevers had to be hidden. A cough might draw suspicion, especially in households terrified of contagion. Most simply disappeared quietly. Their beds were filled by morning. The staff would whisper, of course, in corners and storerooms. They'd remember names and symptoms, trade stories over late-night chores. But the official records never said much. Just a name, then a blank. If a servant sneezed during a shift, they were expected to apologize. If they coughed more than once, they were replaced for the evening, not to rest, but to work elsewhere. The laundry room, usually, steam was thought to be cleansing. The truly sick were rarely seen again. Still, there was no room for pity. The system didn't allow it. Servants were meant to function, not feel. But they did feel, deeply. One winter, a head cook named Marin took to leaving warm stones wrapped in cloth at the corners of the scullery where the youngest girls worked. These small rebellions against frost, against exhaustion, were often the only luxuries permitted. The manor itself had no mercy. Its stones held cold like memory. The walls sweated in spring, froze in winter. The noble family, wrapped in imported wool and layered silk, often spoke of weather in abstract terms. On rare occasions, a guest would take notice. An elderly countess once asked a maid if she wasn't terribly cold without gloves. More often, there was ignorance than cruelty. Yet somehow they endured. Not because it was noble, but because there was no other choice. In the dormitories, when the candles were snuffed and silence fell, you could hear it in the way they slept. Not deeply, but shallowly. Some said it shaped them. That a servant who survived enough winters could no longer feel weather the same way. They became immune, or perhaps resigned, and maybe that was true. Because for all the elegance that glimmered above, there was another world below one, made of frozen buckets, bleeding knuckles. To speak of cold in a 19th century manor was not just to speak of discomfort. It was to speak of wear and tear on bodies, minds, and even time itself. For the servants, cold wasn't seasonal, it was structural. It crept into joints until they no longer bent smoothly. It settled into the lungs and lingered, sometimes for life. It made mornings longer and nights feel like punishment. A valet might bend over to tie a boot in January and struggle to stand fully until March. You'd see it in their hands first. The elder maids especially, often in silence. Fingers red and cracked, knuckles swollen from decades of washing in icy water. No one ever saw her place them, but every morning they were there. When asked, she shrugged. Even the grand halls, when empty, seemed to echo with chill. They complained of the inconvenience of sleet or the misery of slushy streets. They never once spoke of how it felt to chip ice from a well at dawn, or to light a fire with hands too stiff to strike the match. Few had families who could support them. Fewer still had homes to return to, with feet tucked close and hands curled beneath chins. The cold followed them into their dreams. One valet joked he could smell frost before it arrived. Another claimed he'd grown calluses on his soul. The manor was cruel, yes, but it offered food, routine, and the illusion of order, even when it hurt them. Their comfort was purchased with invisible effort. Warm bathwater did not appear by magic. And the kind of resilience that never made it into history books, but it was there, in the silent halls, in the worn gloves, in the way a servant learned to light a fire, not just to warm a room, but to remind themselves they were still alive. It was boiled, pail by pail, carried up 3 flights, and poured in silence. One servant said walking through the unlit ballroom felt like walking through the belly of a sleeping beast fast, echoing, and entirely indifferent to your presence. The maid, not permitted to speak without invitation, simply curtsied. The countess gave her a shilling, a grand gesture to her. The maid used it to buy bread for 2, said it was probably a leak in the pipes. Everyone knew she was lying. No one corrected her. Wet socks meant frostbite. There was a boy no older than 12 tasked with sweeping snow from the manor steps every morning. One day he arrived late. A second pair of socks, secretly stitched from an old apron. One winter, the master of the house insisted on outdoor luncheon, despite the snow. Servants spent 6 hours preparing a tented garden feast while dressed in layers of wool and desperation. By evening, 2 had collapsed from cold. One was reprimanded for doing so within view of the guests. A flask passed quietly between co-workers. A moment stolen near the guest fireplace, pretending to dust a mantle. If caught, there was punishment. But if timed well, these flickers of warmth could carry a person through a week. His feet had blackened overnight. The steward docked his pay, calling it carelessness. The boy was never seen again, though his broom remained in the corner for years. They rubbed ointments made from animal fat and herbs, but nothing truly softened them again. One maid, Ilsa, used to hum while she worked. A low tune like a lullaby she couldn't quite remember. In her final winter of service, she stopped. Her fingers had stiffened so badly she could no longer fold napkins to the standard the mistress required. She was quietly dismissed, and the song disappeared with her. Feet were next. Servants rarely had proper boots. Often, what they wore had been passed down, repaired with scraps, stuffed with wool when holes appeared. And yet, illness was never an excuse. Fevers had to be hidden. A cough might draw suspicion, especially in households terrified of contagion. Most simply disappeared quietly. Their beds were filled by morning. The staff would whisper, of course, in corners and storerooms. They'd remember names and symptoms, trade stories over late-night chores. But the official records never said much. Just a name, then a blank. If a servant sneezed during a shift, they were expected to apologize. If they coughed more than once, they were replaced for the evening, not to rest, but to work elsewhere. The laundry room, usually, steam was thought to be cleansing. The truly sick were rarely seen again. Still, there was no room for pity. The system didn't allow it. Servants were meant to function, not feel. But they did feel, deeply. One winter, a head cook named Marin took to leaving warm stones wrapped in cloth at the corners of the scullery where the youngest girls worked. These small rebellions against frost, against exhaustion, were often the only luxuries permitted. The manor itself had no mercy. Its stones held cold like memory. The walls sweated in spring, froze in winter. The noble family, wrapped in imported wool and layered silk, often spoke of weather in abstract terms. On rare occasions, a guest would take notice. An elderly countess once asked a maid if she wasn't terribly cold without gloves. More often, there was ignorance than cruelty. Yet somehow they endured. Not because it was noble, but because there was no other choice. In the dormitories, when the candles were snuffed and silence fell, you could hear it in the way they slept. Not deeply, but shallowly. Some said it shaped them. That a servant who survived enough winters could no longer feel weather the same way. They became immune, or perhaps resigned, and maybe that was true. Because for all the elegance that glimmered above, there was another world below one, made of frozen buckets, bleeding knuckles. Chapter 13. The Widow's Black Veil. There was something different about a household in mourning. A silence deeper than the usual hush of duty. A stillness that seemed to linger in corners and under stairwells, like a breath forever waiting to be released. The mistress, now the widow, descended into formal mourning, and so too did every servant beneath her. Even the flowers were removed, replaced by vases filled with dried lavender and rosemary, symbols of remembrance and restraint. Laughter, already rare among servants, vanished completely. No more humming. No more clinking of teacups in the break room. The house seemed to breathe only in sighs. The first instruction, delivered before dawn the next day, was that all curtains were to be drawn and all clocks stopped at the precise time of death. His shoes remained polished, his desk dusted, his shaving brush still placed near the basin. But nothing was to be moved. His slippers still beside the bed. Not because he believed they needed it, but because the act felt necessary, like a prayer. The black garments remained. Curtains stayed drawn. The clocks, long silent, gathered dust. The household adjusted. New servants were hired and trained in the rules of a house that never moved forward. The servants, though not permitted to express opinions, watched her decline in quiet empathy. A cook, once a week, would make his favorite stew, though it never left the kitchen. Even the brass lost some of its shine, despite regular polishing. There was no joy to reflect. A groundskeeper left white flowers beneath the widow's window after the first snow. No one admitted to any of it. They moved more slowly, spoke more softly. A butler once said, "This house listens now. Best not to speak too loud." They knew the kind of weight she carried, not because they understood the loss of a noble spouse, but because they too had lived in the quiet margins of life. A cat that visited from the garden each morning for cream, and the widow herself, who still walked the halls, trailing black lace and lavender scent, as if searching for something. Or someone. Her eyes were always distant, her voice always low. But she remained, not angry, not cruel, simply paused. They too knew what it meant to be forgotten while still standing in the room. Time still refused to tick. The Baron's coat remained untouched. And the servants, each in their own way, carried the rhythm of mourning like a second uniform. One not stitched of cloth, but of memory. He said the leather grew softer with each pass, like it was remembering something. One rumor claimed the Baron had left her nothing in his will, and that the mourning was a performance to conceal her loss of power. Another claimed she still spoke to him, sometimes, through the keyhole of his locked study. Or someone, his coat still hanging in the entry. Servants passed these ghostly artifacts daily. No one touched them. No one questioned why. It was said the widow wished to preserve his presence. It was also said quietly that she simply could not let go. 12 minutes past 3 in the morning. Every clock, from the grand one in the hall to the tiny one on the scullery wall, was silenced. Time had officially ended. When death arrived in a Viennese manor, it didn't just take a person, it transformed the entire rhythm of the house. And when the master passed, the transformation was total. In this particular house, when the Baron died in late autumn suddenly, without warning, without a final instruction, the entire household shifted overnight. Black crepe was pinned over mirrors. Paintings of cheerful subjects were covered with dark cloth. The widow, known till then for her social calendar and her sharp silver fan, emerged only in black. Every day. Thick black silk in winter. Gauzy black organza in summer. A lot of them. Black bands were to be worn on sleeves for a full year. No one in the household, not even kitchen staff, was permitted to attend music performances, festivals, or public dances. If a maid were seen smiling in the market, word could return and consequences would follow. There was even a ban on certain foods, bright fruits, like cherries or oranges were considered too cheerful for a house in mourning. They were replaced with plums, pears, and simple root vegetables. Even food was expected to grieve. Her veil was long and heavy, trailing behind her like a living sorrow. She spoke rarely and never loudly. Servants were told not to initiate conversation unless absolutely necessary. Meals were delivered silently. Her rooms were cleaned when she was out walking. And even then, only the upper servants were allowed to enter her chambers. Those who had never experienced a mourning period before learned quickly. There were rules. The strangest rule of all, however, was the treatment of the deceased's personal items. One footman admitted to dusting the Baron's shoes each week. Months passed, then a year. The mourning period, officially, was over, but nothing changed. The widow refused to leave the house. There were whispers, of course. Some said the widow had lost her reason. Others believed she was protecting a secret. But in truth, grief simply held her. Like ivy wrapping around the beams of her life, some servants began mourning in their own quiet ways. A chambermaid would fold a napkin and place it without comment on the Baron's chair each morning, and the manner changed. Not just in silence, but in tone. The grand party stopped. The laughter of children visiting from cousin estates faded. New staff sometimes found it oppressive. Some left after a week, unable to stand the muffled days. Others stayed and adapted. Yet there was still life tucked in corners, a mouse that lived behind the warming cupboard. And in the evenings, when the sky outside deepened and the gas lamps flickered to life, the manor felt like it was holding its breath. Chapter 30. The Widow's Black Veil. By the time the second year of mourning passed, the manor itself seemed to forget that joy had ever been permitted. They always did. A kind of silent choreography developed, an unspoken understanding of where to walk, when to step aside, and how to avoid the windows during certain hours when the widow sat and stared out at the garden. Her veil, though thinner now, still obscured most of her face. Began to bake cinnamon rolls on the Baron's birthday each year. No one ate them. They sat in the kitchen for a day, but in that temple, people continued to breathe, to clean, to serve, and very occasionally to dream, when the lamps had all been dimmed and the silence of the upper floors was absolute. The widow, unrelenting. Once, a visiting cousin commented that she was mummifying herself in memory. He was never invited back. They danced there, slowly, clumsily, pretending to waltz to music they could only imagine. It wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. The house had once known music. It still deserved to. A pair of blue ribbons appeared in the laundry, though no one admitted to owning them. Someone likely, one of the footmen, cleaned the mirror in the Baron's study. No one commented, but everyone noticed. Filling the air with memory, then were quietly wrapped and given to the stable hands. Guests returned, though only rarely. The veil remained, but was lighter, almost translucent. She remained. Not a ghost. Not quite. Just a woman in black who had loved and lost, and who, one day, perhaps without realizing it, began to live again. As if she wanted the world to see her again just a little. Even grief, simultaneously. Time, it seemed, had been permitted to move forward again. Slowly, cautiously, like a house waking from a dream. The widow no longer wept. Quiet stories of a house that had nearly forgotten how to live, and of the people who kept it breathing. If she had once cried behind her veil, it had dried up long ago. His coat still hung in the entry, but no longer with reverence, just habit. Now she moved with the slow certainty of someone living not in mourning, but in echo. Her voice, when heard, was low and oddly melodic, like a song being remembered in pieces. No explanation was ever offered. None was needed, older, perhaps, than some expected. Her hair was silver. One day, someone started the old hall clock. It ticked for an hour before stopping again, as if uncertain it was allowed. Her eyes, though ringed with sleeplessness, were clear. She walked straight to the wreckage, nodded once, and said, "Repair it, but don't change the stones. They remember." Then she turned, climbed the stairs, and disappeared again into shadow. No one was injured, but the noise woke nearly the whole house. The servants gathered in confusion, robes and shawls clutched tightly, breath clouding in the cold air. Then, for the first time in years, the widow emerged from her rooms unveiled. Servants who had been in the household for years could not describe her features, only her silhouette. A quiet specter that drifted through her own home like a shadow that had lost its source. The servants no longer flinched at the sight of black crepe, nor blinked at the perpetual gloom in the drawing rooms. What once felt strange had become natural. Light was unwelcome. Smiles were rationed, and the past was never mentioned out loud. Still, people adjusted. Despite the stiffness of the rules, a kind of strange companionship grew between the staff and the widow. Not friendship, not familiarity, but a shared understanding. They too lived in the aftermath. They too had sacrificed time and comfort for the memory of a man none of them had truly known. The grief was hers, but they bore its echo. Of course, not everyone obeyed so carefully. Some rebelled in tiny ways. Weeded every corner. She'll come back, he'd say to no one in particular. Someday, when asked who she was, he'd shrug. Whoever's missing. One chambermaid, frustrated with years of gloom, took to placing a single yellow flower in the Baron's study every Monday. She never spoke of it, and no one dared remove it. It became a kind of secret ritual, a defiant dot of color in a world that had forgotten warmth. The gardener, an old man named Otto, refused to let the hedges grow wild. Though the widow never walked the garden paths anymore, Otto trimmed every branch, even the cook, usually too practical for superstition. Life beneath the veil, it seemed, had become a kind of ritual in itself. The house was a temple to absence. Sometimes, the younger servants would sneak into the grand ballroom at night. And yet, no matter how far time crawled forward, the clocks remained stopped. The master's study untouched. The bed unchanged. The years dulled everything. One winter, unusually harsh even by Viennese standards, a chimney collapsed in the east wing. She looked ordinary. After that night, small things began to shift. Candles were lit earlier. Curtains opened slightly in the morning. Servants began to speak a little more freely. Not loudly, but no longer in whispers. The cook's stew grew richer. Even the widow, it seemed, had grown weary of her own grief. By the time the 5th year passed, the rules had softened. Not vanished, never that, but softened. Music was allowed softly from the kitchen. And perhaps the most surprising change was this. One spring morning, the clocks were wound. All of them. Still, the servants never forgot those years beneath the veil. They carried them like weathered books. The Baron never returned, of course. But his absence, once all-consuming, had been folded into the rhythm of the house like any other memory. And the widow? Chapter 14. When the noble family vanished. There are few things more unsettling to a servant than a silent house that should be full. A grand manor is meant to hum with movement footsteps. Overhead, laughter from the dining room, the clink of silver on porcelain. But one morning, just as winter melted into a muddy Viennese spring, the sound stopped. The noble family had vanished. Not with drama. Not with notice. Simply gone. It began like any other morning. The maids rose early, half asleep, carrying coal scuttles and linen bundles through the servant halls. It had happened once before, though not without a letter or a list of instructions. But this time there was nothing. No note on the desk, no luggage gone, no carriage seen leaving. The cook was already up, muttering to herself over a pan of oats. Then he said something no one expected. "We continue as usual." A valet entered the drawing room, expecting the familiar chaos of half-finished tea and scattered gloves from the night before, but found it undisturbed. The staff cleaned, polished, maintained, as if the family were simply out for a walk and might return at any moment. Unused, that was strange. The family was always restless. No official closure, and besides, leaving was not an option for most of the staff. A footman claimed he saw a figure in the garden after dark, standing still among the yew trees, wearing a long coat that looked far too fine for a stranger. This manor was their livelihood, their shelter, so they stayed. Not out of loyalty, but necessity. Jewelry still in its velvet box. The master's cane leaning against a door frame. A child's doll face down on the rug of the nursery. She never turned it in. She burned it in the stove and said nothing. There was always a shawl over the arm of a chair, A handkerchief dropped under the pianoforte, a book left open to a page no one would finish. Louder, somehow, in its emptiness. The doors creaked in strange rhythms. The chandeliers swayed without breeze. The portraits on the landing, always lifeless, now seemed to watch with subtle disapproval. He maintained the same schedule, the same poise. He instructed the staff to prepare for guests. Just in case, he said. But no guests ever came. Letters sent to the city estate were returned unopened. The bank stopped answering inquiries. And still, the wages arrived on time, each month in neat brown envelopes. No signature, no message, or curiosity. Upstairs, the chambers were silent. Beds made, wardrobes closed, fires unlit. Their lives were too hard, too physical, too grounded in the demands of the day. But the longer the family remained missing, the more the house itself began to change. The butler, a man named Herr Baumgart, immediately noticed something was off. By whom, no one could say. And then there were those who whispered darker things. That the manor had taken them. That something ancient beneath the floors had finally woken. He did not speak much, but he had an eye for routine, and this wasn't routine. The footmen were sent to knock. They took to carrying candles through the halls, even in daylight. One maid refused to go near the east wing alone. She said she dreamed every night of someone knocking softly at the window from the inside. No reply. Maids peered into rooms they were never meant to enter unless summoned. Everything was clean, empty, orderly. Was it political? Vienna, after all, was never free of tension, or someone whispered had something happened to them. Something no one dared speak of aloud. At first, they assumed an early departure. Perhaps the Baron and Baroness had gone to the countryside, to one of their lesser estates, without announcing it. And all their belongings remained. By midday, the household had gathered in the kitchen. Whispered theories flew like flour dust. Had there been a family emergency? Had they fled debts? Herr Baumgart quieted the room with a single raised hand, and they did. Meals were prepared and not eaten. Fires were lit in cold rooms. Beds were turned down, then up again. For days, this went on. Then weeks. What else could they do? There were no instructions. Of course, people began to talk. One scullery maid swore she'd heard voices from the cellar, one night low, urgent. A young housemaid found a crumpled paper in the study, half a letter, torn and smudged. We must leave before. Then nothing. Rumors multiplied. Some believed the family had uncovered a scandal and gone into hiding. Others were convinced they'd been taken. These were not people who gave in easily to superstition. It felt different, colder, even as spring arrived. Servants began sleeping in pairs. Herr Baumgart remained unmoved. That, perhaps, was the strangest part of all. Someone, somewhere, remembered them, paid them, maintained the illusion that the household still had purpose. And so the staff continued, because what else was there? But behind every polished doorknob, behind every swept stair, the question lingered. What had really happened? Because noble families don't just disappear. Not without noise, not without record. Yet this one had. Months passed, then seasons. The staff marked the passage of time not by holidays or noble birthdays, but by the garden. Buds became blossoms, leaves fell, and snow returned, as if the house were cycling through memories while waiting for someone who would never arrive. After a year, no one truly expected the family to return. Not really, but they didn't speak of it in those terms. To admit it aloud felt dangerous, like severing the last fragile thread that connected the manor to its original purpose. So they went on pretending not in delusion, but in habit. Because purpose, even a hollow one, was better than none at all. Some of the newer staff hired to replace those who left or quietly passed away asked questions. Where are the Baron and Baroness? Why is the master's study untouched? Who sends the wages? The older ones would shake their heads and say, it's best not to wonder too hard in this house. They weren't trying to frighten anyone. They were simply tired of trying to explain something that had no proper end. There was never a police investigation, no estate auction, no read aloud in a solemn room, just silence. And in Vienna, Where bureaucracy usually clung like frost on windows, that silence was its own message. Someone, somewhere, had decided this family's absence was not to be noticed. And the servants, those who remained, became keepers of something stranger than tradition. They were not running a household anymore. They were curators in a museum where the exhibits were warm beds, folded linens, and silent waiting rooms. Over time, the manor drew attention, not from the press or the city elite, but from the curious. An architecture student once arrived at the gate unannounced, hoping to sketch the rare east-facing facade. He was permitted to wander the grounds, but not to enter. He left his notebook behind by accident. One of the maids read it. Most of the pages were architectural diagrams or notes, but one line stood out. This place feels ... preserved, like something waiting for the wrong door to open. There were other visitors, a scholar hoping to document the family genealogy. A distant cousin no one had heard of who spent one night in the guest room and left before dawn, pale and silent. A child from the village who said she had a dream that the Baron's daughter was still in a nursery, hiding in the wardrobe, whispering numbers in her sleep. All of these stories were shared in the kitchen during late evenings, passed around like bread. No one ever tried to verify them. What would be the point? And gradually the house began to accept its new rhythm. Not one of silence, but a waiting. Servants aged and were replaced. Tasks were streamlined. A few rooms were sealed entirely. The grand dining room was no longer dusted daily. The ballroom was used to dry herbs in winter. But the family chambers remained unchanged, sacred, still, their beds made, their slippers aligned. Their perfume bottles faded, half full untouched. Every so often, there was a moment that reminded the staff that something was not quite normal. A drawer found open when it had not been touched. A door locked that had no key. A letter addressed to a name no longer spoken arriving at the back gate. But none of these were cause for alarm. They were simply part of the place now. The manor became known, in time, as a house of echoes. Not haunted, not cursed. Just ... suspended. Locals referred to it as the waiting house. Children dared each other to run up to its great oak doors and knock. No one ever answered. Herr Baumgart eventually retired. He did not leave a forwarding address. The new housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Clara, continued the traditions. She kept the place in order, maintained payroll, oversaw the seasonal duties. When asked how long she planned to stay, she once replied, as long as someone needs to. And that perhaps was the truth of it. Somewhere in that manner, between the folded linens and the stopped clocks, was the idea of continuity. Not because it made sense, but because it was human to maintain the form of things, even when their meaning had evaporated. One footman used to say, with a smile, "We serve absence now." It's easier than serving a temper. And indeed, in a way, the house had become kinder. Without a family to answer to, there were no sudden demands, no midnight tantrums, no spilled wine on velvet chairs. Just routine. Just preservation. Just the hush of memory being tended like an old fire. The last mystery why the wages continued to arrive was never solved. The envelopes came monthly, always the same, always sufficient. No return address. Just a small, unfamiliar seal on the back. No one dared open one early. That, too, had become sacred. Eventually, the story of the vanished family faded from most minds. The house remained, of course, its gardens trimmed, its windows shining, its halls swept. But the names of the Baron and Baroness were rarely spoken. They belonged to a past that had drifted just far enough away to be remembered in the way of dreams. Half story. And so the servants stayed and worked and aged. Some moved on, some did not. A few even claimed they heard footsteps now and then, late at night, soft and even, as if someone were returning home from a very long journey. But no doors ever opened, no one ever returned, and the house endured. As some houses do. With dignity, with dust, and with stories too soft to write down, but too strange to forget.